The Tale of the Hands of God by Rainer Maria Rilke. One morning recently, I met the lady who lives next door. We exchanged greetings. "What an autumn!" she exclaimed after a pause, and looked up at the sky. I did the same. The morning was indeed very clear and exquisite for October. Suddenly, I had an idea. "What an autumn!" I cried, waving my hands about a little. And my neighbour nodded approvingly. I watched her thus for a moment. Her good, healthy face bobbed up and down so amiably. It was very bright. Only round the lips and at the temples there were little shadowy wrinkles. How could she have got them? And then I asked, all unexpectedly, "And your little girls?" The wrinkles in her face vanished for a second, but gathered again at once, darker than before. "Well, thank God, but—" My neighbour began to walk on, and I now strode along at her left, as is proper. "You know they have both reached the age, those children, when they ask questions all day long. What? All day long, and even into the night." "Yes," I murmured, "there is a time." But she took no notice. "And not just questions such as, where does this horse-tram go? How many stars are there? And is 10,000 more than many? Quite different things. For example, does God speak Chinese too? What does God look like? Always everything about God. But that's something we ourselves don't know." "No, of course," I agreed, "though we can make certain guesses." "Or about God's hands. What is one to—" I looked my neighbour in the eyes. "Pardon me," said I very politely. "You just said the hands of God, did you not?" She nodded. I think she was a little surprised. "Well," I hastened to add, "I happen to know something about his hands. By chance," I remarked quickly, as I saw her eyes grow round. "Quite by chance, well," I concluded with considerable decision, "I will tell you what I know. If you have a moment, I will accompany you to your house. That will just give me time." "Gladly," said she, when at last I let her speak, still much astonished. "But wouldn't you like to tell the children?" "To tell the children myself? No, dear lady, that wouldn't do. That wouldn't do at all. You see, I get embarrassed whenever I have to talk with children. That in itself is not bad, but the children might think I was embarrassed because I felt myself telling lies, and as the veracity of my story is very important to me, you can repeat it to the children. You will surely tell it much better than I could. You can put it together and embellish it. I will just give you the simple facts in the shortest form. Shall I?" Very well," said my neighbour absently. I reflected. "In the beginning—" But I broke off at once. "I may assume that you, dear lady, already know many of the things that I would first have to tell the children, for example, about the creation." There was a considerable pause. "Yes, and on the 7th day—" The good woman's voice was high and sharp. "Stop," said I. "We must think of the earlier days too, for indeed it is they that concern us. Well, God, as we know, began his work by making the earth, dividing it from the waters and decreeing light. Then he fashioned with amazing rapidity things. I mean the big, real things that are rocks, mountains, a tree, and after this pattern many trees." Now I had for some time been hearing footsteps behind us, which neither caught us up nor fell back. That bothered me, and I became entangled in my story of the creation as I went on in the following manner. One can only arrive at an understanding of this swift and fruitful activity if one assumes that after long and deep reflection, everything must have been already in his head before he— Now, at last, the footsteps were beside us, and a not exactly pleasant voice fastened itself upon us. "Oh, surely you are speaking of Herr Schmidt. Pardon me." I looked at the newcomer with annoyance, but my companion became very much embarrassed. She coughed. "No, that is, yes, we were just speaking, in a way." "What an autumn," said the other woman suddenly, as though nothing had happened, and her little red face beamed. "Yes," I heard my neighbour reply. "You are right, Frau Hupfer, an exceptionally fine autumn." Then the ladies parted. Frau Hupfer tittered on. "And give the dear children my love." My good neighbour took no more notice. She was so curious to hear my story. I, however, declared with incomprehensible asperity, "Yes, but now I've forgotten where we stopped." "You were just saying something about his head, that is." My neighbour turned scarlet. I was truly sorry for her, so I quickly went on. "Well, you see, as long as only things had been created, God did not need to look down on the earth continually. Nothing could happen there. The wind was, indeed, already moving among the mountains, which were so like the clouds it had long known, but it still shunned the trees with a certain mistrust. And that was what God wanted. The things he had fashioned almost in his sleep. But when he came to the animals, the work began to interest him. He bent over them, and only seldom lifted his broad brows to cast a glance down at the earth. He forgot it completely when he began to create man. I don't know which complicated part of the body he had arrived at, when there was a rush of wings about him. An angel hurried by, singing, 'Thou who seest all.' God started. He had caused that angel to sin, for it was a lie he had just sung. Quickly, God the Father peered down, and sure enough, something had already happened that was hardly to be remedied. A little bird was fluttering hither and thither over the earth, as though it were frightened, and God was not in a position to help it home, for he had not seen out of which forest the poor creature had come. He grew very vexed, and said, 'The birds are to sit still where I put them.' But then he remembered that at the request of the angels he had given them wings, and this circumstance annoyed him even more. Now, in such a state of mind, nothing is so salutary as work, and busied with the construction of man, God quickly grew happy again. He had the eyes of the angels before him as mirrors, measured his own features in them, and slowly and carefully modelled the first face on a ball in his lap. He had succeeded with the forehead, but it was much more difficult for him to make the two nostrils symmetrical. He stooped lower and lower over the work, when a wind passed over him again. He looked up. The same angel was circling round him. No hymn was to be heard this time, for with the lie the boy's voice had been extinguished. But God could see by his mouth that he was still singing, 'Thou who seest all.' At that moment St. Nicholas, who stood high in God's favour, came up to him and said through his big beard, 'Your lions are sitting quite still, and very haughty beasts they are, I must say. But a little dog is running round on the very edge of the world, a terrier. See, he will fall off in a moment.' And indeed, God noticed a little bright speck, white, like a tiny light dancing about in the neighbourhood of Scandinavia, where the earth is so terribly round already. And he was exceedingly angry, and reproachfully told St. Nicholas if he didn't like his lions, he should try and make some himself. Whereupon St. Nicholas walked out of heaven and slammed the door so hard that a star fell down, right on the terrier's head. Now the mischief was done, and God had to admit to himself that it was all his own fault, and he determined not to take his eyes off the earth any more. And so it was. He left the work to his hands, which, of course, are very wise themselves, and although he was extremely curious to see what man might look like, he continued to gaze fixedly down at the earth, where now, as if out of spite, not a little leaf would stir. In order to have at least a little pleasure after all this trouble, he had bidden his hands to show him man first, before they handed him over to life. Repeatedly he asked, as children ask when they play hide-and-seek, "Ready?" But in answer he heard the kneading of his hands, and he waited. It seemed very long to him. Then suddenly he saw something falling through space, something dark, and apparently coming from quite near him. Filled with evil foreboding, he called to his hands. They appeared, all blotched with clay, hot and trembling. "Where is man?" God thundered at them. The right hand flew at the left and cried, "You dropped him." "Excuse me," cried the left, irritated. "You insisted on doing it all by yourself, and you wouldn't even let me have anything to say." "But you ought to have held him." And the right hand drew back as if to strike. But then it thought better of it, and both hands said together, drowning each other's voices, "The fellow was so impatient. He was in such a hurry to live. It is not our fault. Really, we are both innocent." But God was seriously angry. He pushed both hands away, for they blocked the earth from his sight. "I have finished with you from now on. Go and do as you like." And that is what his hands have been trying to do ever since. But whatever they start, they can only make a beginning. Without God, there is no perfection. And so, at last, they grew tired of it. Now they are on their knees all day long, doing penance. At least, so it is said. To us, however, it appears as though God were resting, because he is angry with his hands. It is still the 7th day. I was silent for a moment. My companion used that moment very sensibly. "And do you think they will ever again be reconciled?" "Oh, yes," I said. "At least, I hope so." "And when might that be?" "Not until God knows what man, whom his hands dropped against his will, looks like." My neighbour reflected. Then she said with a laugh, "But all he needs do is to look down." "Excuse me," said I politely. "Your remark is very much to the point, but my story is not yet done. You see, when the hands had got out of the way, and God looked over the earth again, another instant, or rather 1,000 years, which is of course the same thing, had gone by. Instead of one man, there were 1,000,000. But they were all already wearing clothes, and as the fashion was very unbecoming at that time and even distorted people's faces, God received an entirely false, and I will not conceal the fact, a very bad impression of mankind." Said my neighbour, wanting to make a remark. I took no notice, but concluded with great emphasis. "And that is why it is urgently necessary that God should learn what man really is like. Let us rejoice that there are those who tell him." But she did not yet rejoice. "And who might they be, if you please?" "Simply the children, and now and again the people too who paint, write poems, build—" "Build what? Churches?" "Yes, churches too, and everything." My neighbour slowly shook her head. Parts of my story seemed to her very remarkable. We had already gone past her house, and now turned round again. Suddenly she exclaimed with a merry laugh, "But what nonsense, since God is omniscient! He must have known exactly where, for example, the little bird had come from." She looked at me triumphantly. I must confess, I was rather taken aback. But when I had recovered my composure, I succeeded in assuming a very serious expression. "Dear lady," I informed her, "that is really a story in itself. But lest you think that is merely an excuse on my part, Naturally, she protested warmly. I will briefly explain. God has all the attributes, of course. But before he was in a position to exercise these faculties, as it were, upon the world, they all seemed to him like a single great force. I don't know whether I make myself clear, but in the face of things his powers grew specialized, and became, to a certain degree, duties. It was hard for him to remember everything. There are always conflicts. Incidentally, all this I am telling to you alone, and you must on no account repeat it to the children. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of it," my listener declared. You see, if an angel had flown by him singing, "Thou who knowest all," everything would have come right. And there would have been no need for this story. Exactly, I confirmed, and I began to take my leave. But are you absolutely certain about all this? I am absolutely certain, I replied, almost solemnly. Then I shall have plenty to tell the children today. I should love to be able to listen. Goodbye. Goodbye, answered my neighbour. Then she turned back again. But why did that particular angel? My dear friend, said I, interrupting, I now see that your two dear little girls ask so many questions, not because they are children. But, she asked inquisitively, well, the doctors say there are certain hereditary traits. My neighbour shook her finger at me, but we parted, nevertheless, the best of friends. When I met my good neighbour again later, after a considerable interval indeed, she was not alone, so I could not ask her whether she had told her little girls my story, and with what success. But my doubts upon that matter were dispelled by a letter I received soon afterwards. As I have not the writer's permission to publish it, I must confine myself to telling how it ended, whence, without further ado, you will see who wrote it. It closed with the words, I and 5 other children, counting myself. I answered by return of post as follows. My dear children, I well understand your liking the tale of the hands of God. I like it too. But all the same, I cannot come to see you. Do not take it amiss. Who knows whether you would like me? I have an ugly nose, and if, as sometimes happens, it also has a tiny red pimple at the tip, you would stare at that little point the whole time and be astonished, and would not even hear what I was saying a little lower down. And you would probably dream of that little pimple. All this wouldn't suit me at all. Therefore, I suggest another way out of the difficulty. We have, even without your mother, a lot of friends and acquaintances in common who are not children. You will soon find out who they are. To these intermediaries I will tell a story from time to time, and they will tell it to you much more beautifully than I could. For there are some very great poets among these friends of ours. I will not tell you what my stories will be about, but as I know that nothing is closer to your minds and hearts than God, I shall bring in at every suitable opportunity whatever I know about him. If anything isn't correct, write me another nice letter, or let me know through your mother, for it is possible my memory might fail me at many points, because it is already so long since I have heard the nicest stories, and because since then I have had to remember a lot that are not so nice. That is the way it happens in life. But all the same, life is a glorious thing, and of that my stories will often speak. With love, I, who am only one, counting myself. The Stranger, by Rainer Maria Rilke. A stranger has written me a letter. Not of Europe has the stranger written me, nor of Moses, nor of the great or the small prophets, nor of the Emperor of Russia, nor of the Tsar Ivan the Terrible, his cruel ancestor, not of the mayor, or of our neighbour the cobbler, not of the town near by, not of the distant towns, And even the forest with the many deer in which I lose myself every morning is not mentioned in his letter. He tells me nothing about his mother or about his sisters, who have probably married long ago. Perhaps his mother is dead. How else could it be that in a 4-page letter I find her nowhere mentioned? He shows a much, much greater confidence in me. He makes me his brother. He tells me of his need. In the evening, the stranger comes to see me. I light no lamp. I help him off with his coat and beg him to drink tea with me, for it is just the hour at which I daily drink my tea. And on such intimate visits, one may be at ease. As we are about to sit down, I notice that my guest is restless. His face is full of fear, and his hands tremble. "Look," say I, "here is a letter for you." And then I begin to pour out the tea. "Do you take sugar? And lemon, perhaps? In Russia, I learned to drink tea with lemon. Will you try it?" Then I light a lamp and place it in a far corner, rather high, so that twilight remains in the room, only somewhat warmer than before, a rosy twilight. And then my guest's face seems more serene, warmer, and far more familiar. I welcome him once more with the words, "You know, I have been expecting you for a long while." And before the stranger has time to be astonished, I explain, "I know a story which I would like to tell no one but you. Do not ask me why, only tell me whether your chair is comfortable, whether the tea is sweet enough, and whether you want to hear the story." My guest had to smile. Then he said simply, "Yes." To all 3 questions, yes? To all 3. We both leaned back simultaneously in our chairs, so that our faces became shadowy. I put my glass down, rejoiced at the golden glint of the tea, slowly forgot this joy again, and asked suddenly, "Do you still remember God?" The stranger reflected. His eyes sank deep into the darkness, and with the little points of light in the pupils, they resembled 2 long tree-lined avenues in a park, over which summer and sun lie luminous and broad. These too begin like this, encircled by twilight, stretching in a more confined darkness up to a distant, shimmering point, the exit on the far side to a perhaps still brighter day. While I was realizing this, he said, hesitating, and as though he only reluctantly used his voice, "Yes, I still remember God." Good. I thanked him, for it is with him that my story deals. But first, tell me, do you sometimes talk to children? Well, yes, occasionally, just in passing, at least. Perhaps you know that God, in consequence of some horrid disobedience of his hands, does not know what a finished man really looks like. I once heard that somewhere, but I don't know from whom, my guest replied, and I saw uncertain memories driving across his brow. No matter, I broke in. Listen to the story. A long time God endured this uncertainty, for his patience is as great as his strength. Once, however, when dense clouds had reign between him and the earth for many days, so that he hardly knew any more whether he had not merely dreamed everything, the world and men and time, he called his right hand, which had so long been banished from his sight and hidden in small, insignificant works. It came willingly, for it believed that God wanted at last to forgive it. When God saw it there before him in its beauty, youth, and strength, he was indeed tempted to forgiveness. But he remembered in time and commanded it without looking at it. "You are to go down to earth. You are to take on the form you will see there among men, and to stand naked upon a mountain, so that I can observe you closely. As soon as you arrive below, go to a young woman and say to her, but quite softly, 'I want to live.' At first there will be a little darkness about you, and then a great darkness, which is called childhood. And then you will be a man and climb the mountain as I have commanded you. All this will last but a moment. Farewell." The right hand then took leave of the left, called it many pleasant names. Indeed, it has even been declared that it suddenly bowed down before it and said, "Hail, Holy Ghost." But here St. Paul stepped up and smote off God's right hand, and an archangel caught it up and bore it away under his wide mantle. But God laid his left hand on the wound so that his blood should not stream over the stars, and thence fall down in sorrowful drops upon the earth. A little later, God, watching attentively all that went on below, saw that men in iron garments were busying themselves about one mountain more than all others, and he expected to see his hand climb up there. But there came only a man, wearing what seemed to be a red cloak, who was dragging upwards some black swaying thing. At the same instant, God's left hand, lying over his open wound, began to grow restless, and suddenly, before God could prevent it, it left its place, and rushed about madly among the stars, crying, "Oh, poor right hand, and I cannot help you." And it tugged hard at God's left arm, on the very end of which it hung, and tried to tear itself free. And the whole earth was red with God's blood, and it was impossible to see what was happening beneath it. At that time, God very nearly died. With a last effort, he called his right hand back. It came pale and trembling, and lay down in its place like a sick animal, and even the left hand, which already knew a good deal, since it had recognized the right down on the earth as it toiled up the mountain in a red cloak, could not learn from it what had further happened on that hill. It must have been something terrible, for God's right hand has never recovered from it, and suffers under its memories no less than under the old wrath of God, who has not yet forgiven his hands. My voice took a little rest. The stranger had covered his face with his hands. Thus everything stayed for a long time. Then the stranger said, in a voice I had long known, "And why have you told me this story?" "Who else would have understood me? You come to me without rank, without office, without temporal honours, almost without a name. It was dark as you came in, yet I noticed in your features a resemblance." The stranger looked up, questioning. "Yes?" I answered his silent gaze. I often think perhaps God's hand is on its way again. The children have heard this story, and apparently it was told them in such a way that they could understand everything, for they love this story. Why God Wants Poor People, by Rainer Maria Rilke. The foregoing story has spread so widely that the good schoolmaster goes about town looking very much pained. I can understand that. It is always bad for a teacher when children suddenly know something which he has not told them. The teacher should, so to speak, be the only hole in the fence through which one can see into the orchard. If there are other holes too, the children will press every day round a different one, and will soon tire of the view itself. I would not have set down this metaphor, for perhaps not every teacher would agree to being a hole, but the schoolmaster of whom I speak, my neighbour, heard the comparison from me first, and moreover considered it extremely apt. And if somebody should think otherwise, the authority of my neighbour is decisive for me. He stood before me, fidgeted constantly with his glasses, and said, "I don't know who told the children this story, but in any case it is not right to burden and strain their imagination with such extraordinary ideas. The story in question is a kind of fairy tale." "I happen to have heard it," I interrupted. I was not lying, for since that evening it really had been repeated to me by the lady next door. "Indeed," said the schoolmaster. That seemed to him easily explained. "And what do you think of it?" I hesitated, and he quickly went on. "In the first place, I think it wrong to treat religious, especially biblical subjects, in a free and arbitrary manner. At any rate, it has all been so expressed in the Catechism that it could not be better told." I wanted to make a remark, but remembered just in time that the good schoolmaster had used "in the first place," so that according to the syntax and for the balance of his sentence, there must follow a "then," and perhaps even an "and finally," ere I might permit myself to add something. And so it happened. As the schoolmaster has also delivered this very sentence, the faultless construction of which will delight every connoisseur, to others who would be no better able to forget it than I was, I will here record only that which came like the finale of a symphony after the beautiful preparatory words, "and finally." "And finally, letting pass the very fantastic conception, it seems to me the whole subject has not even been sufficiently examined and considered from every angle. If I had time to write stories—" "You miss something in this particular story?" I could not refrain from interrupting. "Yes, I miss a good deal, from the point of view of literary criticism, as it were, if I may speak to you as a colleague." I did not understand what he meant, and said modestly, "You are too kind, but I've never done any teaching." Suddenly, a thought struck me. I broke off, and he continued somewhat coldly. "To take just one instance, it is not to be assumed that God, if one wants to go so far into the meaning of the story, that is, that God, I say, that God should have made no further attempt to see man as he is. I mean—" Now I thought I should propitiate the good schoolmaster again. I made a little bow, and began, "Everybody knows that you have devoted yourself wholeheartedly, and, if one may say so, not without finding reciprocal affection, to a close study of the social question." The good schoolmaster smiled. "Well then, I may assume that what I now propose to tell you will not be altogether remote from your interest, especially as it refers to your last, very perspicacious remark." He looked at me with astonishment. "You mean that God—" "Indeed," I confirmed. "God is just on the point of making a new attempt." "Really?" the schoolmaster exclaimed. "And is that known to the authorities?" "As to that, I can tell you nothing definite," I said regretfully. "I am not in touch with those circles. But do you still want to hear my story?" "You would be doing me a great favour." The schoolmaster took off his spectacles and carefully polished the lenses, while his naked eyes seemed to be ashamed. I began. "Once God was looking down into a great city. As his eyes soon wearied of all the confusion, to which the networks of electric wires contributed not a little, he decided to limit his gaze for a while to a single high lodging-house, as this was far less trying. Simultaneously, he remembered his old wish to see a living man, and to this end he looked down into the windows of each story in turn. The people on the first floor, a rich merchant and his family, were almost all clothes. Not only that all parts of their bodies were covered with costly stuffs, the outlines of this apparel were so formed in many places that one saw there could be no body underneath. On the second floor, it was not much better. The people who lived on the third floor had distinctly fewer clothes on. but were so dirty that God saw only grey furrows, and in his goodness was all ready to command that they should be fruitful. At last, in a crooked little room under the roof, God found a man in a shabby coat who was busy kneading clay. "Oh-ho! Where did you get that?" he cried. The man did not even take his pipe from his mouth, and growled, "The devil knows where. I wish I'd become a cobbler. Here I sit and worry." And whatever God asked, the man was in such a bad humour that he gave no answer. Until one day he got a long letter from the mayor of that town. Then, unasked, he told God everything. He had had no commission for so long. Now, suddenly, he was to make a statue for the public park, and it was to be called Truth. The sculptor worked day and night in a distant studio, and various old memories came to God as he saw this. Had he not still been angry with his hands, he too would have begun to make something again. But as the day came when the statue, which was called Truth, was to be carried out to its place in the gardens, where God too could have seen it in its perfection, a great to-do arose, for a commission of city fathers, schoolmasters, and other influential persons had demanded that the figure should first be partially clothed before the public viewed it. God did not understand why, and the sculptor cursed loudly. City fathers, schoolmasters, and the rest, they brought him to this sin, and God will surely call them to account. But you are coughing terribly." "It will pass," said my schoolmaster, in perfectly clear tones. Well, I have little more to tell. God left the lodging-house and the public park, and would have withdrawn his gaze altogether, as one pulls a fishing rod out of water with a swing to see if anything is bitten. This time, something actually hung there. A tiny little house with several people in it, who all had very little on, for they were very poor. "That's it then," thought God. "People have to be poor. These, I believe, are already very poor, but I will make them so poor that they haven't even a shirt to put on." This God undertook to do. Here I made a full stop, to indicate that I had come to the end. The good schoolmaster was not satisfied. He found this story just as little finished, rounded off, as the preceding one. "Yes," I said apologetically, "a poet ought to get hold of that story and invent some sort of fantastical ending, for it really has no end." "How?" queried the good schoolmaster, and looked at me expectantly. "But, my dear sir," I reminded him, "how forgetful you are. Are you not yourself a chairman of our local charities?" "Yes, I have been that for some 10 years, but—" "That's just it. You and your society have been preventing God this long time from attaining his object. You clothe the people." "Oh, don't mention it," said the schoolmaster modestly. "That is simply one's Christian duty. It is, of course, pleasing to God in the highest degree." "Ah, you are quite sure of that in authoritative circles?" I asked guilelessly. "Naturally we are. In my very capacity as chairman of charities, not a little praise has come to my ears. I'll tell you in confidence that, when the next promotions take place, my activities— you understand?" The good schoolmaster blushed bashfully. "Accept my very best wishes," I responded. We shook hands, and the schoolmaster went his way with such proud, measured steps that I am sure he must have been late for school. As I learned later, a part of this story, as far as was proper for them, became known to the children after all. I wonder whether the schoolmaster made up an ending for it. How Treason Came to Russia by Rainer Maria Rilke. I have another friend in the neighbourhood. This is a fair-haired, lame man who sits, summer and winter, in a chair close by the window. He can look very young. In his listening face there is often something boyish. But there are also days when the minutes pass over him like years, and suddenly he is an old man whose dim eyes have already almost let go of life. We are old friends now. At first we always looked at each other. Later we smiled involuntarily. For a whole year we bowed, and since God knows when, we have been exchanging accounts of one thing and another, indiscriminately, just as it happens. "Good morning," he called as I came by. His window was still open to the rich and quiet autumn. "I have not seen you for a long time." "Good morning, Ewald." I stepped up to his window, as I always did in passing. "I was away." "Where have you been?" he asked with impatient eyes. "To Russia." "Oh, so far." He leaned back, and then, "What kind of a country is it, Russia? Very large, isn't it?" "Yes," said I. "It is large, and besides." "Was that a stupid question?" smiled Ewald, and he blushed. "No, Ewald, on the contrary. Your asking what kind of country is it makes various things clear to me. For instance, how Russia is bounded." "On the east?" my friend threw in. I reflected. "No." "On the north?" inquired the lame man. "You see," I had an inspiration. "The reading of maps has spoiled people. There, everything is flat and level, and when people have noted the 4 points of the compass, they think they've finished. But a country is no map. It has mountains and abysses. It must touch something on top and underneath as well." My friend considered. "You are right. I wonder what Russia touches in those 2 directions." Suddenly, the invalid looked like a boy. "You've got it," I exclaimed. "Perhaps God?" "Yes," I confirmed. "God." "So?" My friend nodded, quite satisfied. Only then did doubts assail him. "But is God a country?" "I don't think so," I replied. "But in primitive languages, many things have the same name. There is probably a kingdom called God, and he who reigns over it is also called God. Simple peoples cannot always distinguish their country from their king. Both are great and good, terrible and great." "I understand," the man at the window said slowly. "And does one notice this proximity in Russia?" "One notices it all the time. The influence of God is very strong. However much you may bring from Europe, all Western things turn into stones as soon as they have passed the frontier. Sometimes precious stones, but only for the rich, the so-called educated classes, while from beyond, from the other kingdom, comes the bread on which the people live." "And which they probably have in abundance." I hesitated. "No, that is not the case. Certain circumstances make the imports from God difficult." I tried to divert him from this thought. "But they have adopted many of the customs of that broad kingdom, all the ceremony, for instance. You speak to the Tsar as you would to God." "Oh, so you don't say Your Majesty?" "No, you call them both Little Father." "And you kneel to them both as well?" "You throw yourself down before both of them, touch the earth with your forehead, and weep, and say, 'I am a sinner. Forgive me, Little Father.' We Germans, seeing that, call it unworthy slavery. I think differently about it. What does kneeling signify? It is meant to express reverence. But you can do that well enough by uncovering your head, a German would say. Well, yes, raising your hat, bowing, they are also, in a way, expressions of it. Abbreviations that have come about in those countries where there was not so much room that everybody could throw themselves on the ground. But abbreviations we soon use mechanically, no longer aware of their meaning. That is why it is good, where there is still room and time to do so, to write the gesture out in full, the whole beautiful and weighty word, reverence. Yes, if I could, I too would kneel down, mused the lame man. But in Russia, I continued after a pause, many other things too come from God. One feels that everything new is introduced by him, every garment, every dish, every virtue, and even every sin must first have his sanction before it comes into use. The sick man looked at me. He seemed almost frightened. It is only a fairy tale I refer to. I hastened to reassure him. A so-called bylinja, something that has been. I will tell you the substance of it quite briefly. The title is How Treason Came to Russia. I leaned against the window, and the lame man closed his eyes, as he liked to do when a story was about to begin. The terrible Tsar, Ivan, wanted to lay tribute upon the neighbouring princes, and threatened them with a great war if they would not send gold to Moscow, the White City. The princes, after due deliberation, spoke as one man. "We give you 3 riddles to solve. Come, on the day we appoint, to the east, to the white stone where we shall be gathered, and tell us the 3 answers. If they are correct, we will give you the 12 barrels of gold that you demand of us." At first, Tsar Ivan Vasilievich considered, but the many bells of his white city, Moscow, disturbed him. So he called his wise men and counsellors before him, and each one who could not answer the riddles he caused to be led out to the great red square where the church of Vasily the Blessed was just being built, and simply beheaded. Thus occupied, time passed so quickly for him that he suddenly found himself on his way to the east, to the white stone by which the princes waited. To none of the 3 questions had he any answer. But the ride was long, and there was still always the possibility that he might meet a wise man. For at that time many wise men were in flight, as all kings had the habit of ordering their heads to be cut off, if they did not seem wise enough. Now, as it happened, the Tsar did not meet any of these. But one morning he saw an old bearded peasant who was building a church. He had already got as far as the framework of the roof, and was laying on the small laths. It seemed very odd that the old peasant should climb down from the church over and over again in order to fetch one by one the narrow laths which were piled below, instead of taking a lot at a time in his long kaftan. In this way he had to climb up and down continually, and there seemed to be no prospect of his ever getting all those hundreds of laths into place. So the Tsar grew impatient. "Idiot!" he cried. That is how one usually addresses the peasants in Russia. "You ought to load yourself up with your wood and then crawl up on the roof. That would be much simpler." The peasant, who at the moment was on the ground, stood still, shielded his eyes with his hand, and replied, "That you must leave to me, Tsar Ivan Vasilievich. Every man knows his own craft best. Nevertheless, as you happen to be riding by, I will tell you the answer to the 3 riddles, which you will have to know when you get to the white stone in the east, not at all far from here." And he divulged to him the 3 answers in turn. The Tsar could hardly thank him for astonishment. "What shall I give you in reward?" he asked at last. "Nothing," said the peasant, fetched another lath, and started up the ladder. "Stop!" commanded the Tsar. "This will never do. You must express a wish." "Well, little father, since you so command, give me one of the 12 barrels of gold, which you will get from the princes of the East." "Good," nodded the Tsar. "I will give you a barrel of gold." Then he rode away quickly, so that he should not forget the answers again. Later, when the Tsar had returned from the East with the 12 barrels of gold, he shut himself up in Moscow, in his palace, in the heart of the 5-gated Kremlin, and he emptied one barrel after the other on the shining tiles of the hall, so that a veritable mountain of gold grew up and cast a great black shadow on the floor. In his forgetfulness, the Tsar had emptied the 12th cask too. He wanted to fill it up again, but it grieved him to have to take away so much gold from the glorious pile. In the night, he went down into the courtyard, scooped fine sand into the barrel until it was 3/4 full, crept softly back into his palace, laid gold over the sand, and next morning sent the cask by a messenger to that part of the broad land of Russia where the old peasant was building his church. As he saw the messenger approaching, the peasant came down from the roof, which was still far from finished, and called out, "You need come no nearer, my friend. Go back with your barrel, which is 3/4 full of sand, and 1 scant quarter of gold. I do not need it. Tell your master that up to now there has been no treason in Russia, and it is his own fault should he notice that he cannot trust any man, for he has now shown the way of betrayal, and from century to century his example will find many imitators in all Russia. I do not need the gold. I can live without gold. I did not expect gold from him, but truth and righteousness. But he has deceived me. Say that to your master, the terrible Tsar Ivan Vasilievich, who sits in his white city of Moscow with his evil conscience, dressed in a dress of gold." After riding a while, the messenger looked back once more. The peasant and his church had vanished, and the piled laths no longer lay there. It was all empty, flat country. Then the man tore back in terror to Moscow, stood breathless before the Tsar, and told somewhat incoherently what had happened, and how the supposed peasant was no other than God himself. "Could he have been right?" my friend said softly, when the last words of my story had died away. "Perhaps," I replied, "though, you know, the people are superstitious. But I must go now, Ewald." "I am sorry," said the lame man sincerely. "Will you not tell me another story soon?" "Gladly, but under one condition." I stepped to the window once more. "Namely?" asked Ewald in surprise. "When you have a chance, you must repeat them all to the children in the neighbourhood," I begged. "Oh, the children come to me so seldom now." I consoled him. "They'll come all right. Evidently you have not felt like telling them anything of late, and perhaps you had nothing to tell, or too much. But if someone knows a real story, do you believe that can remain a secret? Never fear, it gets told about, especially among the children. Goodbye." With that, I left him. The children heard the story on the self-same day. How Old Timofey Died Singing by Rainer Maria Rilke. What a pleasure it is to tell stories to a lame man. Healthy people are so changeable. They look at things now from this, now from that angle, and when you have been walking along with them on your right for an hour, they may suddenly answer you from your left, simply because it occurs to them that that is more polite and shows a more refined upbringing. With a lame man, there is no danger of this happening. His immobility makes him resemble the inanimate things with which he fosters many intimacies, makes him, so to speak, a thing far superior to other things. a thing that listens, not only with its silence, but also with its rare, quiet words, and with its gentle, reverent feelings. Best of all, I like telling stories to my friend Ewald, and I was very glad when he called to me from his accustomed window. "I must ask you something." Quickly I went up and greeted him. "Where did you get the story you told me last time?" he finally asked. "Out of a book?" "Yes," I answered sadly. "The historians have kept it buried there since it died. That is not so very long ago. Only 100 years earlier it lived, carelessly for sure, on many lips. But the words that people use now, those heavy words one cannot sing, were its enemies, and took from it one mouth after another, that in the end it lived, secluded in poverty, on one pair of dry lips, as on a miserable widow's portion. And there it died, leaving no heirs, and was, as I have already said, buried with all honours in a book, where others of its family already lay." "And was it very old when it died?" asked my friend, entering into the conceit. 400 to 500 years, I informed him truthfully. Some of its relations attained an even greater age. "How? Without ever coming to rest in a book?" asked Ewald, amazed. I explained. So far as I know, they were travelling from mouth to mouth all the time. "And did they never sleep?" "Oh yes. Rising from the lips of a singer, they might stay now and then in some hut, where it was warm and dark." "But were people so quiet that songs could sleep in their hearts?" Ewald seemed thoroughly incredulous. "They must have been. It is said that they spoke less, danced dances of slowly growing intensity that had something soothing in their sway, and above all, they did not laugh loudly, as one not infrequently hears them do today, despite the generally advanced state of our civilization." Ewald was on the point of asking another question, but he suppressed it and smiled. "I ask and ask, but perhaps you were about to tell me a story." He looked at me expectantly. "A story? I don't know. I only wanted to say that these songs were the heritage of certain families. One had taken it over, and one passed it on, not quite untouched, with traces of daily use, yet still undamaged, like an old Bible that is handed down from father to son. A disinherited man differed from his brothers, who had come into their rights, in that he could not sing, or knew only a small part of the songs of his father and grandfather, and lost with the other songs that great piece of experience which all these Bellini and Skaski represent to the people. Thus, Yegor Timofeyevich, for instance, had married a beautiful young wife, against the will of his father, old Timofey, and had gone with her to Kiev, to the holy city, beside which the graves of the greatest martyrs of the Holy Orthodox Church are gathered. Father Timofey, who was known as the best singer within 10 days' journey, cursed his son, and told his neighbours he was often convinced that he had never had any such son at all. Nevertheless, he grew dumb with sorrow and remorse, and he sent away all the young people who came crowding into his hut, in order to become the inheritors of the many songs that were locked up in the old man, as in a dust-covered violin. "Father, our little father, give us only one song or another. See, we will carry it into the villages, and you shall hear it in every farmyard as soon as evening comes and the cattle in the stables are still." The old man, who continually sat on the stove, shook his head all day long. He no longer heard well, and as he never knew whether one of the lads, who always hung listening round his house now, had not just asked for a song again, he would sign with his white head tremulously, "No, no, no," till he fell asleep, and even then a while, in sleep. He would gladly have done as the young men asked, He himself was sorry that his dumb, dead dust was to lie upon these songs, perhaps quite soon now. But had he tried to teach one of them something, he would surely have had to remember his own boy, Yegorushka. Who knows what might have happened then? For only because he never spoke at all had no one seen him weep. They were there, the sobs, behind every word, and he always had to close his mouth very quickly and carefully, lest they should come out too. Old Timofey had begun very early to teach his only son, Yegor, a few songs, and as a boy of 15, Yegor could already sing more and better than all the grown-up youths in the village and the neighbourhood. At the same time, the old man, mostly on a holiday when he was somewhat drunk, would say to the lad, "Yegorushka, my little dove, I have already taught you to sing many songs, many Bellini, and also the legends of the saints, almost one for every day. For, as you know, I am the best singer of the whole government, and my father knew, so to speak, all the songs of the whole of Russia, and some Tartar stories as well. You are still young, and therefore I have not told you the most beautiful Bellini, in which the words are like icons, and not to be compared with ordinary words. And you have not yet learned to sing those melodies that no man, were he Cossack or peasant, has been able to listen to without weeping." This Timofey repeated to his son every Sunday, and on all the many holidays of the Russian year, that is, quite often, until Yegor disappeared after a violent scene with the old man, taking with him the beautiful Ustyanka, the daughter of a poor peasant. In the 3rd year after this event, Timofey fell ill, at the very time when one of those many pilgrimages that are always on their way from all parts of the vast empire to Kiev was about to start. His neighbour, Osip, came to see the sick man. "I am going with the pilgrims, Timofey Ivanitch. Permit me to embrace you before I go." Osip was not a friend of the old man's, but now that he was starting on this long journey, he found it necessary to take leave of him, as of a father. "I have sometimes offended you," he sobbed. "Forgive me, my little heart. It happened in drunkenness, and one cannot help that, as you know. Now I will pray for you, and light a candle for you. Goodbye, Timofey Ivanitch, my little father. Perhaps you will get well again, if God wills it. Then you will sing for us once more. Ah, yes, it is a long time since you have sung. What songs those were! The one about Duke Stepanovich, for instance. Do you think I have forgotten it? Oh, how stupid you are! I still know it perfectly. Of course, not like you. You really knew how to sing, one must admit. God gave you that. To another he gives something else. To me, for instance—" The old man, who was lying on the stove, turned round with a groan, and made a movement as though he would say something. It sounded very softly, like Yegor's name. Perhaps he wanted to send him a message, but when Osip from the door asked, "Did you say something, Timofey Ivanitch?" he lay quite still again, and only shook his white head feebly. All the same, God knows how it happened, hardly a year after Osip had gone away, Yegor returned quite unexpectedly. The aged man did not recognize him at once, for it was dark in the hut, and his old eyes were reluctant to take in a new, unfamiliar figure. But when Timofey heard the stranger's voice, he started and jumped down from the stove on his rickety old legs. Yegor caught him, and they clasped each other in their arms. Timofey wept. The young man asked over and over again, "Have you been ill a long time, father?" When the old man had regained a little composure, he crept back onto his stove, and inquired severely in a changed tone, "And your wife?" A pause. Yegor spat. "I have sent her away, you know, with the child." He was silent a while. "One day, Osip comes to see me." "Osip Nikiforovitch?" says I. "Yes," he answers. "It is I. Your father is sick, Yegor. He can no longer sing. It is all silent now in the village, as though it had no soul any more. Nothing knocks, nothing stirs, no one weeps any more, and there seems to be no real reason to laugh either. I think it over. What's to be done? So I call my wife. 'Ustjonka,' say I must go home. No one else is singing there now. It is my turn. Father is sick." "Good," says Ustjonka. "But I cannot take you with me," I explain. "Father, you know, won't have you. And probably I shall not come back to you either, once I am there again and singing." Ustjonka understands me. "Well, God be with you. There are many pilgrims here now. They will give alms. God will help Yegor." And so I went away. And now, Father, tell me all your songs. The rumour spread that Yegor had come back, and that old Timofey was singing again. But that autumn the wind went so violently through the village that none of those who passed by could tell for sure whether there really was singing in Timofey's house. And the door was not open to anyone who knocked. The two wanted to be alone. Yegor sat on the edge of the stove on which his father lay, now and then bringing his ear close to the old man's lips, for he was indeed singing. His old voice, somewhat cracked and quavering, bore all his most beautiful songs to Yegor, and Yegor would sometimes sway his head or swing his hanging legs, quite as though he were already singing himself. This went on for many days. Timofey kept finding another and another song in his memory, each more beautiful than the last. Often at night he would wake his son, and while he gestured uncertainly with his withered, twitching hands, he would sing a little song, and then another, and yet another, till the lazy morning began to stir. Soon after singing the most beautiful of all his songs, he died. He had often complained bitterly during his last days that he still carried a vast quantity of songs within him, and had no time left to impart them to his son. He lay there with furrowed brow, in intense and anxious recollection, and his lips trembled with expectancy. From time to time he would sit upright, sway his head to and fro for a while, move his lips, and at length some faint little song would come forth. But now, for the most part, he kept singing the same verses about Duke Stepanovitch, which he particularly loved, and his son had to appear astonished and pretend he was hearing them for the first time, in order not to anger the old man. After old Timofey Ivanitch had died, the house, in which his son now lived alone, remained shut up for a time. Then, in the following spring, Yegor Timofeyevitch, who now wore quite a long beard, stepped out of his door and began to walk about the village and sing. Later he visited the neighbouring villages too, and the peasants began to tell each other that Yegor had become at least as accomplished a singer as his father Timofey, for he knew a great number of grave and heroic songs, and all those melodies to which no man, were he Cossack or peasant, could listen without weeping. Besides, his voice is supposed to have had such a soft and sorrowful tone as had never been heard from any other singer, and this quality always appeared, quite unexpectedly, in the refrain, wherefore it was particularly moving. So at least I have heard tell. "Then he did not learn that tone from his father?" asked my friend Ewald after a while. "No," I answered. "It is not known how he came by it." I had already stepped away from the window, but the lame man moved again and called after me. Perhaps he was thinking of his wife and his child. Tell me, did he never send for them after his father had died?" "No, I don't think so. At least, he was alone when he died." The Song of Justice by Rainer Maria Rilke. When I next passed Ewald's window, he waved to me and smiled. "Have you promised the children something definite?" "How do you mean?" I asked in surprise. "Well, when I had told them the story of Yegor, they complained that God did not come into it." I was startled. "What? A story without God? But how is that possible?" Then I remembered. Indeed, it is true. That story, as I now think it over, says nothing about God. I can't understand how that could happen. Had someone asked me for such a story, I believe I should have thought all my life in vain. My friend smiled at this agitation. "You must not take it to heart," he interrupted with a certain kindliness. "I imagine one can never tell whether God is in a story before it is entirely finished. For if only 2 words are missing, indeed, if nothing but the pause after the last word is still due, he may yet come." I nodded, and the lame man went on in a different tone. "Don't you know any more about those Russian singers?" I demurred. "Yes, but should we not rather talk about God, Ewald?" He shook his head. "I do so want to hear more about those singular men. I don't know how it happens. I always imagine if one of them were to come in here." And he turned his head towards the room, in the direction of the door. Then his eyes came back to me quickly, and not without embarrassment. "But that would be quite impossible, of course," he amended hastily. "Why should it not be possible, Ewald? Many things might come to you that are not vouchsafed to people who can use their legs, because they pass so many things by and run away from so much. God has destined you, Ewald, to be a firm point amidst all the hurry. Don't you feel how everything revolves round you? Other people are always pursuing their days, and when they do manage to catch one, they are so out of breath that they cannot talk with it at all. But you, my friend, simply sit at your window and wait. And to him who waits, something always happens. You have a quite particular destiny. Just think, even the Iberian Madonna of Moscow must leave her little shrine and drive in a black coach with 4 horses to those who are celebrating something, be it a christening or a death. But to you, everything must come." "Yes," said Ewald with a strange smile. "I cannot even go to meet death. Many people find him as they go their ways. He is afraid to come into their houses and calls them away to strange lands, to war, up on a high tower, on a swaying bridge, into the wilderness or into madness. Most of them go and fetch him from somewhere outside and carry him home on their shoulders all unwittingly. For death is lazy. If people were not always disturbing him, who knows? He might even fall asleep." The sick man pondered a while, and then continued with a certain pride. "But to me, he will have to come when he wants me, here into my sunny little room where the flowers keep fresh so long, over this old carpet, past this cupboard, between the table and the foot of the bed. It is not so easy to squeeze through, till he reaches my dear old comfortable chair, which will then probably die with me, because it has, so to speak, lived with me. And he will have to do all this in the usual way, without noise, without knocking anything over, without doing anything out of the ordinary. In short, like a visitor. This brings my room extraordinarily near to me. Everything will be acted out on this narrow stage, and that is why this last event will not differ so very much from all the other experiences that have taken place here and are yet to come. Even when I was a child, it always seemed strange to me that people should speak so differently of death from the way they speak of other incidents, and only because no man can tell us what happens to him afterwards. But how then is a dead man to be distinguished from a person who grows serious, sets time aside, and locks himself in order to think quietly about something that has been on his mind for a long time? Among people we can't even remember the Lord's Prayer. How then remember some other more mysterious combination that may consist not of words, but of events? We must go apart into some inaccessible silence, and perhaps the dead are those who have withdrawn themselves in order to reflect upon life." There ensued a brief silence. Then I put an end to it with the following words: "That makes me think of a certain young girl. One might say that she spent the first 17 years of her happy life entirely in looking round her. Her eyes were so large and so self-reliant that they used up all they received, and the life in the young creature's whole body went on independently of them, self-nourished, self-sufficient. At the end of that time, however, some too violent event disturbed these double lives that scarcely touched each other. The eyes seemed to break through, back into her inner being, and the full weight of the outside fell through them into her slumbering heart, and every day plunged so heavily into that deep, precipitous gaze that it burst like glass in her narrow breast. Then the young girl grew pale, began to sicken, to seek solitude, to meditate, and in the end she sought that stillness in which thoughts are probably no longer disturbed." "How did she die?" asked my friend softly, with a slightly husky voice. "She was drowned in a deep, still pool, and on the surface of it many circles came, that slowly widened and grew away from under the white water lilies, so that all the floating blossoms stirred." "Is that a story too?" asked Ewald, as though to keep the silence behind my words from growing too great. "No," I answered. "It is an emotion." "But couldn't it be conveyed to the children too, that emotion?" I pondered. "Perhaps." "And how?" "By another story." And I began. It was at the time when they were fighting for freedom in southern Russia. "Forgive me," interrupted Ewald. "How am I to understand that? Did the people want to get rid of the Tsar? That wouldn't correspond with my idea of Russia, and would contradict what you have told me before. If that is the case, I should prefer not to hear your story, for I love the picture I have made for myself of things over there, and I want to keep it unspoiled." That made me smile, and I reassured him. The Polish pans, I should have said that in the beginning, were the masters in southern Russia, and in those silent, solitary steppes that are known as the Ukraine. They were hard masters. Their tyranny and the cupidity of the Jews, who even held the keys of the churches and would only let the true believers have them for money, had made the young people about Kiev and up the whole Dnieper weary and thoughtful. The city itself, Kiev the Holy, the place where Russia first gave account of herself with 400 church domes, sank always more into itself, and consumed itself in fires that were like sudden lunatic thoughts, behind which the night grows only more boundless. The people of the steppe did not quite know what was happening, but seized with singular unrest, the old men would leave their huts at night and gaze silently into the high, eternally windless heavens. And by day one could see figures appear on the ridges of the kurgans and stand waiting, silhouetted against the flat distance. These kurgans are burial mounds of bygone generations, and spread over the entire plain like a succession of frozen, sleeping waves. And in this country, where graves are the mountains, men are the abysses. Deep, dark, silent are these people, and their words are like weak, swaying bridges over their real being. Sometimes dark birds fly up from the kurgans, Sometimes wild songs drop down into these somnolent people and vanish deep inside them, while the birds are lost in the sky. In all directions, everything is limitless. Even the houses are no protection against the immeasurableness. Their little windows are full of it. Only in the darkening corners of the rooms the icons stand like milestones of God, and the glint of a tiny light runs over their frames like a lost child through the starry night. These icons are the only stay, the only reliable sign on the way, and no house can endure without them. More are always needed, when one is destroyed by age, or when somebody marries and builds himself a hut, or when somebody dies, like old Abraham, for instance, who wanted to take St. Nicholas, the worker of miracles, with him in his folded hands, probably in order to compare the saints in heaven with the image and recognize his favourite among them all. So it comes that Peter Akimovich, properly a shoemaker, paints icons too. When he tires of the one labour, he changes, after he has crossed himself 3 times, to the other, and over his sewing and hammering and his painting the same piety holds sway. He is already an old man, but quite robust still. His back, which he bends over the boots, he straightens up again before the pictures, and thus he has preserved a good carriage and a certain balance in shoulders and backbone. The greater part of his life he has spent all alone, never taking part in the excitement which came of his wife Aculina bearing him children, or of these dying or getting married. It was not till he had reached his 70th year that Peter got in touch with those who remained in his house, and whom he now, for the first time, looked upon as really there. These were his wife Aculina, a quiet, humble person who had given herself almost wholly to her children, an elderly, ugly daughter, and Alyosha, a son, who, born disproportionately late in his father's life, was only 17. Peter wanted to teach him to paint, for he realized that he alone would not be able to cope much longer with all the orders. But he soon abandoned the lessons. Alyosha had painted the Blessed Virgin, but had so little achieved the severe and correct image he was copying that his handiwork looked like a portrait of Mariana, the daughter of Golokopitenko, the Cossack. That is, like something thoroughly sinful. And old Peter hastened, after crossing himself many times, to paint over the offended board with a Saint Dimitri, whom, for some unknown reason, he preferred to all other saints. Alyosha never tried to paint another picture. When his father had not ordered him to gild a halo, he was usually out on the steppe. Nobody knew where. Nobody called him home. His mother wondered at him, and was shy of speaking to him, as though he were a stranger or an official. His sister had always beaten him when he was a child, and now that Alyosha had grown up, she began to despise him, because he did not beat her. Neither was there anybody in the village who bothered about the boy. Mariana, the Cossack's daughter, had laughed at him when he told her he wanted to marry her, and thereafter Alyosha had not asked the other girls if they would accept him as a bridegroom. Nobody had wanted to take him into the Sech, to the Zaporozhian Cossacks, because they all thought him too weak, and perhaps as well too young. Once he had run away to the nearest monastery, but the monks did not take him in, and so only the plain remained to him, the broad, rolling plain. A hunter had once given him an old gun, loaded with heaven knows what. Alyosha always dragged it about with him, but never fired it. First, because he wanted to keep the bullet, and then because he did not know what to shoot. One warm, quiet evening at the beginning of summer, they all sat together at the rough-hewn table on which stood a dish of millet. Peter ate, and the others watched him and waited for what he would leave. Suddenly the old man stopped with his spoon in mid-air and stretched his broad, wrinkled head into the streak of light that came from the doorway, and fell straight across the table into the gloom beyond. They all listened. Outside, on the walls of the hut, there was a sound, as though a night bird gently brushed against the beams with its wings. But the sun had scarcely set, and anyway, night birds rarely ventured into the village. And then again, it seemed as though some other large animal were feeling its way round the house, and as though its groping tread were perceptible along all the walls at once. Alyosha rose quietly from his bench. At the same moment, the door was darkened by something high, black. It shut out the evening and brought night into the hut. It moved forward unsteadily in its great bulk. "Ostap," said the ugly girl in her harsh voice. And now they all recognized him. It was one of the blind Kobzars, an old man who wandered through the villages with a 12-stringed bandura and sang of the great fame of the Cossacks, of their braveness and loyalty, of their hetman Kidiaga, Kukubenko, Bulba, and other heroes, so that all loved to listen. Ostap bowed 3 times in the direction in which he guessed the holy image to be, and it was the Znamenskaya to whom he thus unconsciously turned, sat down near the stove, and asked in a low voice, "In whose house might I be?" "In ours, little father, in the house of Peter Akimovich, the shoemaker," answered Peter genially. He was a lover of song and rejoiced at this unexpected visit. "Ah, Peter Akimovich, the one who paints icons," said the blind man, returning the courtesy. Then there was silence. In the 6 long strings of the bandura, a sound began, grew, and came back, shot out as if exhausted from the 6 short strings. And this effect was repeated in ever-quickening measure, so that finally one had to close one's eyes for fear of seeing the tone hurtle down from the height of the melody it had mounted in such a furious onrush. Then the instrument was silent and gave way to the fine, deep voice of the Kobzar, which soon filled the whole house and called the people out of the neighbouring huts, so that they gathered before the door and underneath the windows. But not of heroes did the song tell this time. The fame of Bulba and Ostranitsa and Nalivaiko seemed already sure. Secure for all time seemed the faith of the Cossacks. Not of their deeds did the song tell that day. And in all who heard, the spirit of the dance seemed to sleep. No one moved a leg or raised a hand. Like Ostap's head, so were the other heads bowed, growing heavy with the sorrowful song. "There is no justice more in the world. Justice, who can find her? There is no justice more in the world, for all justice must bow to the laws of injustice. Today justice lies wretched in chains, and wrong laughs at her. We have seen it, and sits with the pans in the golden seats, and in the golden hall with the pans. Justice lies on the threshold and weeps. Evil and wrong are the guests of the pans, who beckon them, laughing, into their halls, and offer them cups overflowing with mead. O Justice, little mother mine, thy wing is strong as the eagle's wing. There may yet come a man athirst to be just. Then help him, God. He alone can help. He who makes light the days of the just." And heavily the heads were lifted, and on all brows stood silence. This they too saw who would have spoken. And after a short, grave silence, the music of the bandura began again, and this time the ever-growing crowd already understood it better. 3 times Ostap sang his song of justice, and each time it was different. If it was a lament the first time, the second it seemed a reproach, and finally, when at the 3rd time the Kobzar with high-thrown head shouted it like a string of short commands, a wild fury broke from the quivering words and took possession of the listeners, and carried them all away on a great and yet fearful enthusiasm. "Where do the men meet?" asked a young peasant as the singer arose. The old man, who was informed of all the movements of the Cossacks, named a place nearby. The men dispersed rapidly, sharp calls were heard, and the stir of arms. Women wept in the doorways. An hour later, a company of armed peasants marched out of the village towards Chernigov. Peter had offered the Kobzar a glass of new wine, in the hope of learning more from him. The old man sat and drank, but gave only curt replies to the shoemaker's many questions. Then he thanked his host and went. Alyosha led the blind man over the threshold. When they were alone out in the night, Alyosha asked, "And may everybody go to the war?" "Everybody," said the old man, and vanished with quickened steps, as though the night had made him see. When all were asleep, Alyosha rose from the stove, where he had been lying in his clothes, took his gun, and went forth. Outside, he felt himself suddenly embraced and softly kissed on the hair. He recognized Akulina in the moonlight, tripping hastily towards the house. "Mother!" he exclaimed, and a strange feeling came over him. He hesitated a while. A door banged somewhere, and a dog howled nearby. Then Alyosha slung his gun over his shoulder and strode strongly away, for he wanted to catch up with the men before morning. In the house, they all pretended not to notice Alyosha's absence. Only as they sat down to table next day, and Peter became aware of the empty place, he got up again, went into the corner, and lit a candle before the Znamenskaya. A very thin candle. The ugly girl shrugged her shoulders. Meanwhile, Ostap, the blind old man, was already on his way through the next village, singing sadly, in a gently lamenting voice, the Song of Justice. The lame man waited a while. Then he looked at me in surprise. "Well, why don't you finish? It is the same as in the story about treason. That old man was God." "Oh, and I didn't know," said I, awed by the thought. A scene from the Ghetto of Venice by Rainer Maria Rilke. Herr Bohm, house owner, chairman of the Borough Council, honorary chief of the Voluntary Fire Brigade, and many other things as well. To put it briefly, Herr Bohm must have overheard one of my conversations with Ewald. No wonder, the house on the ground floor of which my friend lives belongs to him. Herr Bohm and I have known each other by sight for a long time, but the other day the chairman of the Borough Council stopped, raised his hat a little, just enough for a small bird to have flown out, had one been caught under it, smiled politely, and opened our acquaintance with the words, "You travel sometimes?" "Oh, yes," I answered, rather vaguely. "I may occasionally." Then he went on confidentially. "I believe we two are the only people here who have been in Italy." "Indeed?" I made an effort to be a little more attentive. "Well then, it is really most necessary that we should talk together." Herr Bohm laughed. "Italy, to be sure. That at least is a country worth seeing. I am always telling my children. Take Venice, for instance." I stopped. "You still remember Venice?" "But I put it to you," he groaned, for he was rather too stout to be easily provoked. "How could I fail to? When you've once seen it, that piazzetta. Don't you agree?" "Yes," I answered. "I remember with particular pleasure the ride through the Grand Canal, that soft, soundless gliding along the borders of the past." "The Palazzo Franchetti," he exclaimed. "The Cadoro," I rejoined. The fish market. The Palazzo Vendramin. Where Richard Wagner," he hastily added, being a German of culture. I nodded. "The Ponte, you remember?" He smiled knowingly. "Of course, and the museum. Not to forget the academy, where a Titian—" So Herr Bohm had put himself through a kind of examination, which was rather trying. I undertook to compensate him with a story, so I began forthwith. "Past the Fondaco de Turkey and the fish market, and you tell your gondolier, 'To the right.' He will look surprised, and may even ask, 'Dove?' But you insist on being taken to the right. You leave the gondola in one of the dirty little canals, bargain with the gondolier, tell him what you think of him, and finally walk away through narrow alleys and black, smoke-darkened archways until you come to an empty, open square. All this for the simple reason that here my story took place." Herr Bohm diffidently touched my arm. "Pardon me? What story?" His small eyes darted timidly hither and thither. I reassured him. "Oh, just a little story, my dear sir, of no importance at all. I cannot even tell you when it happened. Perhaps under the Doge Alviso Moncenigo, but it may as well have been somewhat earlier or somewhat later. You have probably seen Carpaccio's pictures. They look as though they were painted on purple velvet. Everywhere something warm, as of sunny woodlands, shines through, and round the subdued lights glistening shadows gather. Giorgione painted on dull, aging gold, Titian on black satin. But at the time of which I speak, light pictures were in favour, done on a ground of white silk, and the name that was ceaselessly toyed with, the name that lovely lips threw out into the sunlight and exquisite ears caught up again, that name was Gian Battista Tiepolo. But all this has nothing to do with my story. It concerns only the real Venice, the city of palaces, of adventures, of masks and white nights on the lagoon, which carry like no other nights the sound of secret serenades. In the part of Venice of which I shall tell, there are only poor, ordinary sounds. All the days go by monotonously, as though they were but a single day, and the songs one hears there are swelling plaints that never rise to heaven, but settle like a pall of smoke over the alleys. As soon as twilight comes, many furtive figures crowd the streets. Countless children have their homes upon the squares, and in the narrow, cold doorways, playing with chips and leavings of that same motley flux of glass from which the masters pieced together the solemn mosaics of San Marco. Nobles seldom find their way into the ghetto. Only when the Jewish maidens gather at the well, one may sometimes notice a figure, black in cloak and mask. Certain people know by experience that this figure carries a dagger hidden in those folds. Somebody is supposed to have seen the young man's face once in the moonlight, and since then they declared this dark, slim visitor to be Marcantonio Priuli, son of the proveditore Niccolo Priuli and the beautiful Caterina Minelli. It is known that he waits under the porch of Isaac Rosso's house, then, when people are gone, walks straight across the square and enters the house of old Melchizedek, the wealthy goldsmith who has many sons and 7 daughters, and by his sons and daughters many grandchildren. Esther, the youngest granddaughter, awaits him, leaning against her aged grandsire's shoulder in a low, dark chamber, in which many objects glitter and glow, and silk and velvet hang softly over the costly vessels, as though to quench their full golden flame. Here, Marcantonio sits on a silver-embroidered cushion at the feet of the venerable Jew, and tells of Venice as he would tell a fairy tale, which has never quite happened like that anywhere. He tells of the theatre, of battles fought by the Venetian army, of foreign visitors, of pictures and statues, of the censer on Ascension Day, of the carnival, and of the beauty of his mother, Caterina Minelli. He sees in all these much the same meaning, different expressions of power and love and life. To his two listeners, it is all strange, for the Jews are strictly excluded from all society but their own, and even the wealthy old Melchizedek never set foot within the domain of the great council, although as a goldsmith, and because of the general respect in which he is held, he might safely have dared to do so. In the course of his long life, the old man had obtained from the great council many privileges for his people, who looked upon him as a father. But ever and again he had had to endure the reaction. Every time a calamity befell the state, vengeance was taken on the Jews. The Venetians themselves were much too kin with them in spirit to use them for commercial purposes as other nations did. They crippled them with taxes, robbed them of their possessions, and restricted the boundary of the ghetto more and more, so that the Jewish families, which in the midst of all their hardships increased fruitfully, were forced to build their dwellings up into the air, one upon the roof of the other. And their city, which did not lie by the sea, thus slowly grew up towards the sky, as towards another ocean, and round the square with the well the high buildings rose on all sides, like the walls of some gigantic tower. The wealthy Melchizedek, in the eccentricity of old age, made an odd proposal to his fellow citizens, sons and grandsons. He stipulated that he should always inhabit whichever was the highest of these tiny houses that clustered one above the other in countless stories. This strange desire was readily granted, for the builders themselves no longer trusted the sustaining power of the lower walls, and used such light bricks for the higher stories that the wind did not seem to notice the walls at all. So the old man would move 2 or 3 times a year, accompanied by Esther, who refused to leave him. In the end, they were so high that when they stepped out of the confinement of their room onto the flat roof, there began, at the level of their eyes, another country, of the customs of which the old man would speak in strange words, half psalmodizing. It was a long way up to them now, through the lives of many strangers, over steep and slippery steps, past scolding women, and the onslaughts of hungry children that way led, and its many obstacles cut off all intercourse. Even Marc Antonio no longer came to visit, and Esther hardly missed him. In the hours when she had been alone with him, she had looked at him so large-eyed and so long that it seemed to her he had plunged deep into her dark eyes and died, and that now there was beginning in herself a new, everlasting life, in which he, as a Christian, had of course believed. With this new feeling in her young body, she would stand for hours on the roof, seeking the sea. But high though her house might be, she could only discover the gables of the Palazzo Foscari, then some tower or other, the cupola of a church, a more distant cupola that seemed to shiver in the light, and then a network of masts, beams, poles against the quivering vapour of the sky. Towards the end of that summer, the old man moved once more, although many tried to dissuade him, and the climbing was already hard for him, for a new hut, high above all, had been built. As he crossed the square again after so long a time, leaning on Esther's arm, people gathered round him and bent low over his trembling hands, asking for his advice in many matters, for he was to them like one dead who rises from his grave because a certain time is fulfilled. And so indeed it seemed. The men told him that there had been revolt in Venice. The nobles were in danger, and soon the walls of the ghetto would fall, and all would enjoy the same freedom. The old man answered nothing, and only nodded, as though he had known all this long ago, and much more besides. He entered the house of Isaac Rosso, on the top of which his new abode was perched, and spent half a day climbing the stairs. Up there, Esther bore a delicate, fair-haired child. When she had recovered, she took it in her arms out on the roof, and for the first time filled its open eyes with the whole golden sky. It was an autumn morning of indescribable clearness. Things had a dusky look, almost without lustre. Only now and then flying lights would settle on them, as on large blossoms, rest a while, and then soar away over their gold-rimmed contours into the sky. And there, where they disappeared, that which no one had ever seen from the ghetto before was visible from this high place, a still and silvery light, the sea. And only now, as Esther's eyes had grown accustomed to the glory, did she notice, at the roof's very edge, Melchizedek. He rose with outspread arms, forcing his dim eyes to gaze into the slowly spreading day. His arms remained uplifted, a radiant thought upon his brow. He was as one offering a sacrifice. Then he leaned forward again and again, and pressed his venerable head upon the rough, jagged stones. The people stood assembled on the square below, gazing up at him. Words and gestures rose out of the crowd, but they did not reach the old man, praying in solitude. And the people saw the oldest and the youngest of their kin, as in the clouds. The old man continued, rising proudly to his feet, and then again casting himself down in humility. For a long time he continued, and the crowd below grew, and did not let him out of their sight. Had he seen the sea, or God, the Eternal in his glory? Herr Bohm endeavoured to say something quickly, but he did not succeed at once. "The sea, probably," he then said dryly. "It really is an imposing sight." Whereby he showed himself to be a very sensible and enlightened person indeed. I hastily bade him good-bye, but I could not refrain from calling after him, "Don't forget to tell your children this story." He reflected. "The children? But you know, that young nobleman, Antonio, or whatever his name was, he is not at all a nice character. And then the baby. That baby, that seems rather for children." "Oh," I reassured him, "you forget, my dear sir, that all babies come from God. The children will think it quite natural that Esther had one, living so near the sky." This story, too, the children have heard, and when you ask them what they think it was that the old Jew Melchizedek saw in his ecstasy, they say, without stopping to think, "Oh, the sea, too." Of One Who Listened to the Stones, by Rainer Maria Rilke. I am with my lame friend again. He smiles in his characteristic way. "And you have never told me anything about Italy yet." "Which means I am to do so as soon as I can." Ewald nods, and has already closed his eyes to listen. So I begin. What we experience as spring, God sees as a slight, fugitive smile passing over the earth. Earth seems to be remembering something. In summer she tells everyone about it, until she grows wise in the great autumnal silence, through which she confides in those who are lonely. All the springs you and I have lived through, put together, would not suffice to fill a single one of God's seconds. Spring, if he is to notice it, must not remain in trees and on the meadows. It must somehow manifest itself in man, for then it comes to pass, as it were, not within the limits of time, but rather in eternity, and in God's presence. Once, when this happened, God's glances must have been hovering like sombre wings over Italy. The country down there was bathed in light, the century itself shining like gold. But right across it, like a dark path, lay the shadow of a sturdy man, heavy and black, and far before it the shadow of his creating hands, restless, quivering, now over Pisa, now over Naples, now vanishing over the vague motion of the sea. God could not take his eyes from those hands, which at first seemed to him folded like praying hands. But the prayer that welled up out of them forced them far apart. A silence fell in the heavens. All the saints followed God's gaze, and like him watched the shadow that hid half Italy, and the hymns of the angels froze upon their lips, and the stars trembled, for they feared to have done wrong, and waited humbly for God's angry word. But nothing of the kind happened. The heavens had opened in their whole breadth over Italy, so that Raphael was on his knees in Rome, while the blessed Fra Angelico of Fiesole stood on a cloud and rejoiced over him. At that hour many prayers were on their way from the earth, but God recognized only one thing. The power of Michelangelo rose up to him like the perfume of vineyards, and he suffered it to fill his thoughts. He bent lower, found the striving man, looked beyond his shoulder at the hands that hovered, listening about the stone, and started. Did the very stones have souls? Why was this man listening to the stones? And then the hands awoke before him and tore at the stone, as at a grave from which flickers a faint, dying voice. "Michelangelo!" cried God in fear. "Who is in that stone?" Michelangelo listened. His hands were trembling. "Thou, my God! Who else? But I cannot reach thee." And then God knew that he was indeed in the stone, and he felt fearful and confined. The whole sky was but a stone, and he locked in its midst, hoping for the hands of Michelangelo to deliver him. And he heard them coming, but they were still far away. But the master was at work again. He thought continually, "You are but a little block, and someone else might not find even a single figure in you, but I feel a shoulder here. It is that of Joseph of Arimathea, and here Mary bends down. I feel the trembling of her hands that support Jesus, our Lord, who has just died on the cross. If in this little block of marble there is room for these three, why should I not sometime lift a whole sleeping race out of a rock?" And with broad strokes he set free the three figures from the Pietà. But he did not lift the veils of stone entirely from their faces, as though he feared that their deep sadness might lay a numbness on his hands. So he fled to another stone. But each time he abandoned the task. He gave a brow its full serenity, a shoulder its perfect curve, and if he made a woman, he did not lay the ultimate smile about her lips, lest her beauty might be betrayed. At this time he was designing the monument for Julius della Rovere. He thought to build a mountain over the Iron Pope, and a race of men therewith to people the mountain. Filled with a multitude of dim plans, he went out to his marble quarries. The mountainside rose steep above a humble village. Surrounded by olive trees and weather-beaten rock, the newly broken surfaces of stone appeared like a great pale face under aging hair. Michelangelo stood long before that veiled brow. Suddenly he perceived below it two enormous eyes of stone watching him, and Michelangelo felt his own stature grow under the influence of that look. Now he too towered over the land. It seemed to him that since the beginning of time he and this mountain had been brothers. The valley receded below him as under one climbing, the little huts crowded together like herds of cattle, and the great face of rock, under its white stone veils, appeared ever nearer and more akin to him. It had a waiting expression, motionless, and yet on the verge of motion. Michelangelo pondered. "You cannot be hewn asunder, for you are one." And then he lifted up his voice. "I complete you. You are my task." And he turned back towards Florence. He saw a star and the tower of the Duomo, and about his feet was evening. Of a sudden, at the Porta Romana, he hesitated. The double rows of houses reached out towards him like arms, and already they had taken hold of him and were drawing him into the town. And the streets became ever narrower and more dim, and as he entered his house, he knew himself to be in mysterious hands, from which he could not escape. He fled into the hall, and thence into the low chamber, scarcely 2 paces wide, in which he was wont to write. Its walls leaned upon him, and it was as though they fought with his enormousness, and forced him back into his old, restricted form. And he endured it. He fell upon his knees, and let himself be shaped by them. He felt a never-known humility within him, and himself longed somehow to be small. And there came a voice. "Michelangelo, who is in thee?" And the man in the narrow chamber laid his head heavily upon his hands, and softly said, "Thou, my God, who else?" And all became wide around God. Freely he lifted up his face that was over Italy, and looked about him. The saints stood in mantles and mitres, and the angels with their songs, as with vessels filled at radiant springs, went about among the thirsting stars, and there was no end to the heavens. My lame friend looked up, and suffered the evening clouds to draw his gaze with them along the sky. "But is God there?" he asked. I was silent. Then I bent towards him. "Ewald, are we really here?" And warmly we clasped hands. How the Thimble Came to be God, by Rainer Maria Rilke. When I stepped away from the window, the evening clouds were still there. They seemed to be waiting. Should I tell them a story too? I proposed it, but they took no notice of me. To make myself understood, and to diminish the distance between us, I called out, "I am an evening cloud too." They stopped still, and seemed to scrutinize me closely. Then they stretched their transparent rosy wings towards me. That is how evening clouds greet each other. They had recognized me. "We are lying over the earth," they explained. "More exactly, over Europe. And you?" I hesitated. "Well, there is a country here." "What does it look like?" "Oh," I answered, "things in twilight." "Europe's like that too," laughed a young girl cloud. "Possibly," I said, "but I have always heard that the things in Europe are dead." "Well, of course," said another cloud scornfully. "What nonsense that would be, living things." "All the same," I insisted, "mine are alive. So that's the difference. They can turn into various objects, and a thing that comes into the world as a pencil or a stove need not therefore despair of advancing in life. A pencil may turn into a stick, or, if all goes well, into a mast, and a stove may become nothing less than a city gate." "You seem to me to be a very silly evening cloud," said the girl cloud, who had already expressed herself so pertly. But an elderly cloud feared she might have offended me. "There are all sorts of countries," he said kindly. "Once I chanced to come over a small German principality, and I can never believe that belonged to Europe." I thanked him and said, "I see it will not be easy for us to come to an understanding. Allow me, and I will simply tell you what I saw below me recently. That will probably be the best way." "Please do," agreed the wise old cloud, in the name of all the rest. So I began. There are people in a room. I am fairly high up, you must know, and so it is that to me they look like children. Therefore I shall simply call them children. Well, there are children in a room. 2, 5, 6, 7 children. It would take too long to ask them their names. Besides, they seem to be having an animated discussion, so undoubtedly 1 or 2 names will be dropped in the course of it. They must have been at it for some time already, for the eldest, I observed that they call him Hans, is saying with some decision, "No, things certainly cannot go on like this. I have heard that parents used always to tell their children stories in the evening, or at least on evenings when they had been good, till they went to sleep. Does anything like that happen now?" There was a short pause. Then Hans answered his own question. "It doesn't anywhere. I, for my part, and also because I'm grown up in a way, will gladly let them off those few wretched dragons that would bother them so. But still, they ought to tell us there are fairies, brownies, princes, and monsters." "I have an aunt," a little girl piped up, "and she sometimes tells me." "Oh, rot!" Hans cut her off. "Aunts don't count, they tell lies." The whole assembly was much taken aback by this bold but undeniable assertion. Hans went on. "Besides, we are chiefly concerned with our fathers and mothers, for it is their duty, in a way, to instruct us in these things. Others do it out of kindness. We can't expect it of them. But listen now, what do our parents do? They go round with cross faces and grumble. They scold and storm, and yet they are really so indifferent that if the world came to an end they would hardly notice it. They have something which they call ideals. Perhaps those are some sort of small children that may never be left alone and that make a lot of trouble. But then they shouldn't have had us. Well, I think it is like this, children. That our parents neglect us is regrettable, certainly, but we would put up with that if it were not an indication that the grown-ups are growing stupider, deteriorating, if one may say so. We cannot hinder their decline, for all day long we can have no influence on them, and when we come home late from school we cannot be expected to sit down and try to make them take an interest in something sensible. And it really hurts when one has been sitting under the lamp for hours and mother cannot even get the rule of Pythagoras. Well, it can't be helped. So the grown-ups will grow stupider and stupider. No matter. What can we lose by it? Culture? They take off their hats to each other, but if a bald spot is revealed, they laugh. Anyhow, they are always laughing. If we hadn't the sense to cry now and then, these matters would get entirely out of balance. And they are so conceited. They even declare that the emperor is a grown-up. I read in the newspaper that the King of Spain is a child, and it's the same with all kings and emperors, so don't let them persuade you. But apart from all the superfluous things they've got, the grown-ups have something that really does concern us. I mean God. Now, I have not seen him with any one of them yet, and it is just that looks suspicious. It has occurred to me that in their scatter-brained hurry and haste they may have lost him somewhere. But he is something absolutely necessary. All sorts of things can't happen without him. The sun can't rise, babies can't come, and even bread would stop. Though it comes out of the baker's shop, God turns the big mills. It is easy to find lots of reasons why God is something we cannot do without. Now this much is certain, the grown-ups aren't bothering about him, so we children must do it. Listen to my plan. We are just 7. Each of us must carry God about with him for one day. Then he will be with us the whole week, and we shall always know where he is at the moment. Nobody knew what to say. How was that to be done? Could one take God into one's hand or put him in one's pocket? Then a little boy said,
Once I was all alone in the room. A little lamp burned beside me, and I sat up in bed and said my prayers, very loud. Something moved inside my folded hands. It was soft and warm and like a little bird. I couldn't open my hands because the prayer wasn't over, but I wanted very badly to know, and I prayed awfully fast. When I got to the Amen, I went like this. The little boy spread out his hands and stretched his fingers apart. But there was nothing there. That they could all picture to themselves. Even Hans had no suggestion. They all looked at him, and then he suddenly said, "How stupid! Anything can be God. One has only to tell it." He turned to the red-haired boy standing next him. "An animal wouldn't do, they always run away. But a thing, you see, stays where it is. Whenever you come into the room, by day or night, it is always there. It can very well be God." Gradually, the others became convinced of this. "But we must have a small object," he continued. "Something one can carry with one everywhere. Otherwise it's no good. Empty all your pockets." Then some very strange things appeared. Scraps of paper, india rubbers, feathers, penknives, bits of string, pebbles, screws, whistles, chips of wood, and much else not to be distinguished from this distance, or for which I lack a name. And all these things lay in the children's shallow hands, as though frightened at the sudden possibility of turning into God, while any of them that could shine, shone in order to please Hans. The choice hung in the balance a long time. At last, little Resi unearthed a thimble which she had taken from her mother one day. It gleamed like silver, and for its beauty's sake, it became God. Hans himself put it into his pocket, for he had the first turn, and the other children followed him about all day long and were proud of him. Only it was hard to decide who should have it next day. So Hans, in his wisdom, then and there drew up the programme for the whole week so that no quarrel should break out. On the whole, this arrangement turned out thoroughly satisfactory. One could see at once who had God, for that particular child walked rather more stiffly and solemnly, and wore a Sunday face. For the first 3 days the children spoke of nothing else. At every instant one of them was asking to see God. And though the thimble hadn't changed a whit under the influence of its great dignity, the very thimbliness of it seemed but a modest cloak hiding its real form. Everything proceeded according to order. On Wednesday, Paul had it. On Thursday, little Anna. Then Saturday came. The children were just playing tag and tumbling breathlessly in confusion when Hans suddenly called out, "Who has God now?" They all stood still. Each looked at the other. Nobody remembered having seen him for the last 2 days. Hans counted off whose turn it was. The fact came out. It was little Mary's. And now they were asking little Mary to produce God without more ado. What was she to do? The little girl fumbled round in her pockets. Then only did she remember that he had been given to her in the morning, and now he was gone. She had probably lost him here while she was playing. And when all the other children went home, little Mary stayed alone on the green, searching. Twice people passed and asked whether she had lost anything. Each time the child answered, "A thimble," and went on looking. The people helped her for a time, but soon tired of stooping, and one man said as he left her, "You had better go home now. You can always buy another one." But still little Mary went on searching. The meadow grew stranger and stranger in the dusk, and the grass began to get wet. Then another man came along. He bent over the child. "What are you looking for?" This time little Mary, nearly in tears, answered bravely and defiantly, "I am looking for God." The stranger smiled and took her by the hand, and she let herself be led away as though all were well. On the way, the stranger said, "And look, what a beautiful thimble I found today." The evening clouds had long been growing impatient. Then the wise old cloud, who had grown fat in the meantime, turned to me. "Excuse me, but may I ask what the country is called over which—" But the other clouds ran laughing into the sky and dragged my old friend along with them. A Tale of Death, and a strange postscript thereto, by Rainer Maria Rilke. I was still gazing up into the slowly fading evening sky when someone said, "You seem to be much interested in the country up there." My gaze fell, quick as a thing shot, and I realized that I had come to the low wall of our little churchyard. Before me, on the other side of it, stood the man with the spade, sagely smiling. "I am interested in this country here," he went on, and pointed to the black, damp earth appearing here and there between the many dead leaves that rustled, stirring, although I did not know a wind had sprung up. Suddenly I exclaimed, seized with a violent aversion, "Why do you do that?" The sexton still smiled. "It is a way of earning one's living. And besides, I ask you, don't most people do the same? They bury God up there as I bury men here." He pointed to the sky and explained, "Yes, that too is a great grave. In summer it is covered with wild forget-me-nots." I interrupted him. "There was a time when men buried God in the sky, that is true." "And is it any different now?" he asked, curiously sad. I went on. "It used to be customary for everyone to throw a handful of sky over him, I know. But really he had already ceased to be there. Or at least—" I hesitated. "You know," I began again, "in olden times people prayed like this." And I spread my arms out wide, involuntarily feeling my breast expand at the gesture. In those days, God would cast himself into all these human abysses, unfathomable in their darkness, and only reluctantly did he return into his heavens, which, unnoticed, he drew down ever closer over the earth. But a new faith began, as men could not be made to understand how the new God differed from their old one, for as soon as they began to praise him, men promptly recognized the old God here too. The teachers of the new order changed the manner of praying. They taught the folding of hands and declared, "See, thus does our God wish to be implored, so he must be another God from the one whom heretofore you have thought to receive into your arms." The people saw this, and the gesture of open arms became despicable and dreadful. And later those arms were nailed to the cross, that all might see in them a symbol of agony and death. When God next looked down upon the earth, he was frightened. Besides the many folded hands, many Gothic cathedrals had been built, and the hands and the roofs, alike steep and sharp, pointed towards him like the weapons of an enemy. There is a different valour in heaven. God stepped back into the sky, and when he saw that the steeples and the new prayers were growing behind him, he departed out of his domain at the other side, and thus eluded the pursuit. He was himself astonished to find, out beyond his radiant home, the beginning of a darkness that received him silently. And he went on and on, strangely moved in this dusk that reminded him of the hearts of men. Then did it first occur to him that the heads of men are light, but their hearts full of a similar darkness, and a longing came over him to dwell in the hearts of men, and no longer to move through the clear, cold wakefulness of their brains. Well, God has continued on his way. Ever denser grows the darkness round him, and the night through which he presses on has something of the fragrant warmth of the fruitful soil. And in a little while the roots will reach out towards him with the old, beautiful gesture of wide prayer. There is no wiser symbol than the circle. The God who has fled from us out of the heavens will come to us again out of the earth. And who knows, perhaps you yourself will some day dig free the door. The man with the spade said, "But that is a fairy tale." "In the words with which we speak," I answered gently, "everything becomes a fairy tale, for in them it can never have happened." The man stared for a while, reflecting. Then, with impetuous movements, he pulled on his coat, asking, "Can't we go together?" "Yes, I am going home. I dare say we go the same way. But don't you live here?" He stepped through the little iron gate, swung it gently to on its plaintive hinges, and answered, "No." After a few steps, he grew more confidential. "You were quite right just now," he said. "It is strange that nobody wants to do that job back there. I never used to think about it. But now, as I grow older, thoughts come to me sometimes, singular thoughts, like that about the sky, and others too. Death. What do we know of it? Apparently everything, and perhaps nothing. Often children, I don't know whom they belong to, stand round me as I work, and then I get one of those ideas. I dig like a wild beast so as to draw all my strength away from my brain and use it in my arms. I make the grave I am digging much deeper than the law demands, and a mountain of earth rises beside it. The children run away when they see my wild movements. They think I am angry for some reason." He pondered. "And it is a kind of anger. You grow callous. You think you've got the better of it, and then suddenly, it's no good. Death is something incomprehensible, terrible." We were following a long road under fruit trees, already quite leafless, and on our left the forest began, like a night that might at any moment engulf us. "I would like to tell you a little story," I said tentatively. "It's just long enough to last till we get there." The sexton nodded and lighted his old stub of a pipe. I began. There were two people, a man and a woman, and they loved each other. To love is to accept nothing from anywhere, and to forget all, and to want to receive everything from one person, both that which one already had and all else. That is what these two wanted. But in this daily world, where so much comes and goes, often before one has got into real touch with it, it is not possible to achieve such love. Events rush in from all sides, and chance opens every door to them. For this reason, the two decided to leave the world and go into solitude, far away from the striking of clocks and the noises of cities. And there, in a garden, they built themselves a house. And the house had two doors, one on the right and one on the left. And the right-hand door was the man's door, and everything that was his was to pass through it into the house. The door on the left was the woman's door, and all that came to her was to enter that way. And so it was. The one who woke up first in the morning went down and opened his door, and then there was much that entered until late at night, even though the house was not on the edge of the road. To those who know how to receive, there come into a house the landscape and the light, and a breeze with perfume on its wings, and much else. But things of the past also, forms, destinies came in by both these doors, and all were welcomed with the like simple hospitality, so that they felt as though they had always been at home in the house on the heath. This went on for a long time, and the two were very happy because of it. The door at the left was opened rather more often, but by the right-hand door entered more motley guests. And before this door one morning waited death. The man slammed his door quickly when he recognized him, and kept it tightly bolted all day long. After some time, death appeared at the door on the left. Trembling, the woman slammed it and pushed the heavy bolts. They did not speak to each other of this occurrence, but they opened their doors less often and tried to get along with what they had in the house. Of course, they had to live much more meagerly than before. Their provisions grew scarce, and cares set in. They both began to sleep badly, and in one of those long, wakeful nights, they both at once suddenly heard a strange shuffling and knocking noise. It came from outside the house wall, equally far from the two doors. It sounded as though someone were beginning to break out the stones in order to make a new door midway in the wall. Even in their terror, the two pretended they did not notice anything unusual. They began to talk and laugh unnaturally loudly, and when they were tired out, the burrowing in the wall had stopped. Since that night, both the doors have remained closed. The two live like prisoners. Their health is failing, and they have strange fancies. The sound in the wall is repeated from time to time. Then they laugh with their lips, while their hearts almost die of fear. And they both know that the burrowing is getting always louder and clearer, and they must talk and laugh louder and louder with their always wearier voices. I ceased. "Yes, yes," said my companion. "So it is. That is a true story." "I read it in an old book," I went on to add, "and a very curious thing happened. At the end of the line which tells how death came also to the woman's door, I found, in old and faded ink, a little star. It peeped out from between the words as between clouds, and for a moment I fancied that, were the lines to draw apart, they might reveal a lot of stars standing there behind them, as sometimes happens when the spring sky clears late of an evening. Then I forgot all about the insignificant circumstance, until one day, on the smooth, shiny paper inside the back cover of the book, I found, as though mirrored in a lake, the same little star, and close beneath it, delicate lines began, which flowed away like waves over the pale, glassy surface. The writing had become blurred in many places, but still I was able to decipher nearly all of it. It said something of this sort: "I have read this story so often, on all possible kinds of days, that I sometimes believe I have written it down myself, out of my own memory. But for me, it goes on as I set it down here." The woman had never seen Death. Innocently she let him enter. But Death said rather hurriedly, and as one whose conscience is not clear, "Give this to your husband." And he added hastily, as she looked inquiringly at him, "It is seed, very good seed." Then he went away, without looking back. The woman opened the little bag he had pressed into her hand. There really were seeds in it, hard, ugly grains, and the woman thought, "A seed is something incomplete, belonging to the future. One cannot tell what will come of it. I won't give my husband these unsightly grains. They don't look in the least like a gift. Rather, I will plant them in the flower bed in our garden and wait to see what grows out of them. Then I will lead him to the plant and tell him how I came by it." And so the woman did, and they continued to live as before. The man, who could not forget that Death had stood before his door, was at first somewhat uneasy. But when he saw the woman as hospitable and carefree as ever, he too soon opened the wide wings of his door again, so that much life and light came into the house. The following spring, there stood in the middle of the bed, among the slender tiger lilies, a small shrub. It had narrow, blackish and rather pointed leaves, like those of the laurel, and a peculiar shine lay on their dark surface. Every day the man was on the point of asking whence the plant had sprung, but every day he put it off. In a similar reticence, the woman delayed her explanation from day to day. But the suppressed question on one side and the never-ventured answer on the other drew the two together often before the little shrub, the darkness of which contrasted so strangely with the sunny garden. When the next spring came, they busied themselves with the shrub as much as with the other plants, and they were sad to see it stand surrounded by so many growing flowers, unchanged and mute as in the first year, insensible to all the sun. Then it was that they determined, without telling each other, to devote all their energies in the third spring to this plant. And as that spring approached, they tenderly fulfilled, hand in hand, what each had promised to himself. The garden all round grew wild, and the tiger lilies seemed paler than usual. But once, as, after a night heavy and overcast, they stepped out into the calm garden, shimmering under the morning, they saw that from the sharp black leaves of the strange shrub a pale blue flower had sprung unscathed, bursting the too close sheath of its bud. And they stood before it, united and silent. And now they knew less than ever what to say, for they were thinking, "Now death is flowering." And together they bent down to taste the perfume of the young blossom. And since that morning, everything has been different in the world. Thus I read in the cover of the old book. "And who could have written it?" urged the sexton. "A woman by the handwriting," I replied. "But what good would it have done to find out? The characters were very faded and rather old-fashioned. Probably she had died long ago." My companion was lost in thought. "Only a story," he admitted at last. "And yet it touches one so." "Ah, that is because you don't hear stories often," I replied. "You think so?" He gave me his hand and held it fast. "But I would like so much to repeat it. May I?" I nodded. Then he suddenly remembered. "But I have no one. Whom should I tell it to?" "Oh, that is easy," I answered. "Tell it to the children who sometimes come to watch you at your work. Whom else?" And the children have really heard the last 3 stories, at least the one repeated by the evening clouds only in part, if I am correctly informed. The children are small, of course, and so they are much further from the evening clouds than we. But in the case of this story, that is just as well. For in spite of Hans's long, well-worded speech, they would realize that the scene took place among children, and would criticize my story as experts. But it is better that they should not learn with what effort and how awkwardly we experience the things that happen quite simply and so naturally to them. An Indispensable Society by Rainer Maria Rilke. I have just learned that our town boasts a kind of artists' club. It recently came into being to meet a need that was, as one may easily imagine, very urgent, and rumour goes that it flourishes. When societies are at a loss what to do with themselves, they flourish. They have heard that one must do this in order to be a proper society. Needless to say, Herr Bohm is honorary president, founder, life member, and everything else in one, and has some difficulty in distinguishing between his various dignities. He sent me a young man with an invitation to attend the club's evenings. I thanked him most politely, of course, but I went on to say that my whole activity during some 5 years had consisted in the very opposite. "Picture to yourself," I explained with the necessary seriousness. "Since that time hardly a moment has passed during which I have not been resigning from some society or other, and yet there are still societies which, so to speak, contain me." The young man looked, first with amazement, and then with an expression of respectful pity at my feet. He must have seen in them confirmation of my continuous withdrawals, for he nodded understandingly. That pleased me well, and as I was just going out, I suggested that he accompanied me a little way. So we walked through the town and on beyond, towards the station, for I had business in a neighbouring district. We talked about a variety of things. I learned that the young man was a musician. He told me so, modestly. One would never have guessed it. Besides the profusion of his hair, he was marked by a great, an almost excessive readiness to help. During our not particularly long walk, he twice picked up one of my gloves, held my umbrella for me while I looked for something in my pockets, blushingly drew my attention to the fact that there was something sticking to my beard and a smut on my nose, and his thin fingers stretched themselves out the while, as though they longed to approach my face. In his zeal, the young man even dropped back from time to time and removed from the bushes, with evident satisfaction, dead leaves that had caught among the twigs in falling. I foresaw that through these repeated delays I should miss my train. We were still some way from the station, so I decided to tell my companion a story to keep him by my side. I began without further preliminaries. I know about the founding of one of those societies, one for which there was a real need. You shall see. Not so very long ago, 3 artists met by chance in an old town. The 3 artists naturally did not talk about art, at least, so it appeared. They spent the evening in the back room of an ancient inn, telling each other tales of their travels and experiences of all sorts. Their stories grew briefer and more literal as time went on, and finally they had got down to a couple of jokes which they kept on bandying back and forth. To forestall misunderstanding, I must say at once that they were real artists, intended by nature to be so, as it were, not by chance. This evening which they wasted in the back room of an inn cannot alter the fact, and we shall presently see what came of it. Other people, Philistines, came to the inn. The artists were discomfited and left. The moment they passed out of the door, they were changed men. They walked in the middle of the street, a little separated from each other. Their countenances still showed traces of their recent laughter, that strange disorder of the features. But the eyes of all 3 had become serious and observant. Suddenly, the one in the middle nudged the one on the right, who understood at once. Before them lay an alley, narrow, full of warm, tender twilight. It mounted slightly, which gave a very telling perspective, and there was something unusually secretive about it, and yet intimate too. The 3 artists gave themselves up to the impression for a moment. They said nothing, for they knew that some things cannot be said. They had, after all, become artists, because there are things that cannot be said. Suddenly, the moon rose somewhere, tracing a line of silver round a single gable, and a song floated up from a courtyard. "Bah, what a cheap effect," growled the artist in the middle, and they went on. They were walking a little closer together now, though they still took up the whole width of the street. Thus they came unexpectedly to a square. This time it was the artist on the right who drew the attention of the others. In this broader, more open scene, there was nothing disturbing about the moonlight. On the contrary, it was absolutely necessary that it should be there. It made the square look larger, gave the houses a surprising, expectantly listening life, and the flat, illuminated expanse of the pavement was heedlessly broken in the middle by a fountain and its deep shadow, a boldness which much impressed the artists. They stood close together, imbibing, as it were, at some great breast the mood created by this effect. But they were unpleasantly interrupted. Light hastening footsteps drew near. From the shadow of the fountain, a man's form materialized, welcomed the footsteps and what else belonged to them with the customary tenderness, and the beautiful square had suddenly become a wretched magazine illustration from which the three painters turned as one. "That damned human interest stuff again," shouted the one on the right, designating with this correct technical term the lovers at the fountain. United in their disgust, the three wandered aimlessly round the town for a long time, continually discovering subjects, but each time enraged afresh by the way in which some banal incident or other ruined the tranquil simplicity of the picture. About midnight they were sitting together at the inn, in the bedroom of the one on the left, the youngest, and had no thought of going to bed. Their nocturnal stroll had stirred many plans and projects in their minds, and having discovered themselves to be at bottom kindred spirits, they were now intensely interested in exchanging points of view. They cannot be said to have expressed themselves in faultless sentences. They cast about with a few words which would have conveyed nothing to an uninitiated person. But they understood each other so well by this means that nobody in the adjoining rooms could get to sleep before 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, this long confabulation had a real and tangible result. Something in the nature of a society was founded. That is, it had really existed from the moment the aims and intentions of the three artists had proved to be so similar that one could only with difficulty distinguish between them. The first resolution of the society was promptly carried out. They travelled for 3 hours into the country, and together rented a farm. Staying in town would have had no point at this juncture. Out there, they intended first to acquire their style, that particular personal certainty, the eye, the hand, and whatever they call all of the things without which a painter may indeed live, but cannot paint. In the acquisition of all these virtues, cooperation, the society itself, was to help, and particularly its honorary member, nature. By nature, the painters understood everything that God had made himself, or could, under certain circumstances, have made. A fence, a house, a fountain. These things are usually of human origin. But when they have been standing in the landscape for a time, so that they have taken on certain qualities of the trees and bushes and other things surrounding them, then they pass, as it were, into God's possession, and with that also into the domain of the painter. For the same things belong to God and the artist, be it riches or be it poverty. Well, in the natural surroundings of that communal farm, God could surely not have thought to possess any particular treasure. But it was not long before the artists proved to him the contrary. The country round was flat. That there was no denying. But through the depth of its shadows and the brilliance of its lights, valleys and peaks were created, between which a countless number of intermediate tones corresponded to the wide meadows and fertile fields which constitute the material wealth of a mountainous region. There were but few trees, and almost all of the same species, botanically speaking. But because of the feelings they expressed, the longing of some spreading branch, or the gentle reverence of some standing trunk, they seemed like a great number of individual beings. Many a willow proved to be a personality that continually surprised the artists by the complexity and depth of its character. Their enthusiasm was so great, they felt so much at one in their work, that it is not important that after 6 months each of the three had moved into a house of his own. That was surely just a matter of space. But there is something else which should be mentioned here. The painters wanted to celebrate in some way the first anniversary of their society, out of which so much good had come in so short a time, and to this end each determined secretly to sketch the houses of the other two. On the appointed day they came together, each with his pictures. It so happened that they began to talk about their houses, how they were situated, how conveniently built, and the like. The discussion grew somewhat heated, and in the course of it they forgot the sketches they had brought along, so that each of them arrived home late at night with his unopened parcel. How this could have happened is hard to understand, nor did they show each other their pictures during the next few weeks. And when one went to visit another, which, as a consequence of much work, happened more and more seldom, he found on his friend's easel paintings done during the first period, when they all lived together at the same farm. One day, however, the one on the right— his house was on the right too now, so I shall continue to call him thus— came, in the studio of the one I have called the youngest, upon one of these unconfessed anniversary pictures. He observed it thoughtfully for a time, then took it to the light, and suddenly burst out laughing. "Fancy, I never knew! And it's quite an amusing conception of my house you've given here. A truly clever caricature. The way you've exaggerated form and colour, and the bold interpretation of my gable, which certainly is rather emphasized. Really, there's something in it." The expression on the face of the youngest did not show him at his best. On the contrary, in his consternation he went to see the middle one, the most sensible of the three, hoping to find consolation. For when this sort of thing happened to him, he became depressed and inclined to doubt his own ability. His friend was not in when he arrived, so he began to rummage round the studio, and his eyes promptly fell upon a picture that peculiarly repelled him. It was a house, but a lunatic must have lived in it. What a facade! It could only have been built by a man who had no idea of architecture and had applied his miserable painter's notions to a building. Suddenly, the youngest dropped the picture as though it had burnt his fingers. In its left-hand corner he had seen the date of that first anniversary, and next it, the house of our youngest. Naturally, he did not wait for his host's return, but went home, somewhat out of humour. After this, he and the painter on the right became more careful. They sought subjects far afield, and of course did not dream of preparing anything against the second anniversary of their so inspiring society. Meanwhile, their unsuspecting comrade in the middle was working with great zeal at a subject that lay quite close to the house of the one on the right. Some vague foreboding prevented him from choosing to put the house into his picture. When he brought him the finished product, his friend on the right seemed strangely reticent, just glanced at it, and made some casual remark. Then, after a while, he said, "I did not know you had been away of late, and so far." "How do you mean away? Far?" The middle one didn't understand in the least. "Well, that good bit of work there," replied the other. "Evidently a Dutch subject." The sensible man in the middle laughed heartily. "Excellent," he explained. "That Dutch subject lies before your very door." And he was not to be silenced. But his brother member did not laugh, not at all. He managed a wry smile and said, "A good joke." "Not at all," said the other. "Just open the door and I'll show you." And he started in that direction himself. "Stop," ordered the master of the house. "I hereby declare to you that I have never seen that place, and never shall see it, because to my eyes it is incapable of existing at all." "But," the other expostulated. "You insist?" shouted the one on the right. "Well then, I leave today. You are forcing me to go, for I do not wish to live in such a place. Understand?" That was the end of their friendship, but not of the society, for to this day it has not been statutorily dissolved. Nobody has thought of doing that, and it may rightly be said of this society that it has spread over the whole world. "It shows," interrupted the obliging young man, who had been constantly making as though to speak. "The marvellous results of cooperation. Surely many an outstanding masterpiece has been produced by this intimate partnership." "Allow me," I begged, and he unexpectedly dusted my sleeve. "This was really but the preface to my story, though it is more involved than the story itself. Well, I said the society has spread all over the world, and that is a fact. Its 3 members fled from each other in true horror. Nowhere could they find peace. Each lived in constant fear that one of the others might get hold of a piece of his country and profane it by his malicious presentation. And when they had arrived at 3 opposite points on the earth's periphery, the discomforting idea dawned upon each of them that his sky, the sky he had made his own through his growing originality, was still within reach of the others. In this shattering moment, they began, all 3 at once, to go backwards with their easels, and 5 steps more, and they would have fallen off the edge of the earth into eternity, and would now, with frenzied speed, be performing the double revolution round the earth and round the sun. But God's sympathy and attentiveness averted this terrible fate. God saw their danger, and at that moment, what else should he have done? He stepped out into the middle of the sky. The 3 painters started in astonishment. They fixed their easels and set up their palettes. They could not afford to miss this opportunity. God does not appear every day, nor yet to everybody. And of course, each of the 3 thought God was visible to him alone. For the rest, they grew more and more engrossed in their interesting task. And every time God wants to go back into the sky, St. Luke begs him to stay out a while longer, until the 3 painters have finished their pictures. "And doubtless the 3 gentlemen have already exhibited those pictures, perhaps even sold them?" asked the musician in the gentlest of tones. "What are you thinking of?" I parried. "They are still painting away at God, and they will probably go on painting him till they die themselves. And should they ever meet again, which I consider out of the question, and show each other the pictures they have meanwhile painted of God, who knows, perhaps those pictures would be scarcely distinguishable from one another." And now we had reached the station. I still had 5 minutes. I thanked the young man for accompanying me, and wished him the best of success for the new society which he represented so well. With his right forefinger, he flicked away the dust that seemed to weigh upon the window-sills in the waiting-room, and he was wrapped in thought. I must confess, I was flattering myself that my little story had put him into this reflective mood. When, as a parting gesture, he drew a red thread out of my glove, I counselled him in gratitude. "You know, you can go back across the fields. It's considerably shorter that way than by the road." "Pardon me," the obliging young man bowed. "I think I shall take the road again. I'm trying to remember where it was. While you were being so good as to tell me some really important things, I thought I noticed a scarecrow in a field wearing an old coat, and one of the sleeves, I believe it was the left, had caught on a stake so that it couldn't flap at all. Now I feel a certain duty to pay my little tribute to the common interests of humanity, which I look upon as a kind of society too, by restoring that left sleeve to its proper purpose, namely, to flap in the wind." The young man walked away with the most engaging smile, and I nearly missed my train. Fragments of this story were sung by the young man at one of the club's evenings. Heaven knows who composed the music to them. Herr Bohm, the honorary president, brought them home to the children, and the children remembered some of the tunes. The Beggar and the Proud Young Lady by Rainer Maria Rilke. It happened that we, the schoolmaster and I, were witnesses to the following little incident. We have an old beggar who sometimes stands at the edge of the wood. He was there again today, poorer,
more miserable than ever, almost indistinguishable, through a sort of sympathetic mimicry, from the boards of the decaying wooden fence against which he leaned. But then it happened that a little girl came running up to give him a small coin. That in itself was not extraordinary. It was the way she did it that was surprising. She made her very best curtsy, tendered her little gift hurriedly so that none should see, curtsied again, and was gone. And these 2 curtsies were worthy of a king. This annoyed our schoolmaster quite particularly. He started towards the beggar, probably to drive him from his post against the fence, for we know the good man was a director of the local charities and committed to the prevention of street begging. I held him back. "But," he protested, "we are helping these people. I may even go so far as to say we support them. And now if they beg on the streets too, it's sheer impertinence." "My dear sir," I attempted to calm him, but he continued to drag me along towards the wood. "Dear Professor," I besought him, "I must tell you a story." "Is it so urgent?" he asked venomously. I took him up in all seriousness. "Yes, it is. Before you forget what we chanced to observe just now." The schoolmaster mistrusted me after the last story I had told him. I read that in his face, and added in a conciliatory tone, "Not about God. Truly not. God is not even mentioned in this story. It is something historical." With that, I had won. Just mention the word history, and every schoolmaster will prick up his ears. For history is a subject thoroughly respectable, quite irrefutable, and often pedagogically useful. I noticed that the schoolmaster was polishing his glasses again, a sign that his powers of vision had now shifted to his ears. So I made haste to profit by this opportunity. I began. It was in Florence. Lorenzo de' Medici, young and not yet in power, had just composed his poem Trionfo di Bacco et Ariana, and already it was echoing through all the gardens. In those days, songs lived. Out of the darkness of the poet's soul they arose in the voices of men, and were wafted upon them as on silver skiffs, fearless, into the unknown. The poet began a song, and all who sang it finished it. The Trionfo, as most songs of that time, glorifies life, that violin with serene singing strings over its dark background, which is the stirring of our blood. Stanzas of uneven length mount, merrily tumbling upwards, but each time, just at the point of breathlessness, a short, simple refrain sets in that bends down from the dizzy height, and, fearing the abyss, seems to close its eyes. It runs, "How lovely is youth! It fills us with joy. Yet who would hold it? Youth flees and repents, and if one would be merry, let him be so today. Of tomorrow there is no certainty." It is strange that the men who sang lines such as these were seized upon by a haste, an endeavour to pile all festivity into this today, a tower upon the only rock on which it was safe to build. Thus one can explain the crowded figures in the pictures of the Florentine painters. They sought to unite all their princes and their ladies and their friends in a single canvas, for painting was slow work, and who could know whether, when the time had come for the next picture, all these people would still be so young and gay and friendly. This spirit of impatience was naturally strongest in the young men. The most brilliant of these were sitting together after a banquet on the terrace of the Palazzo Strozzi, discussing the festivities that were presently to take place before the church of Santa Croce. A little apart from the rest stood Palla degli Albizzi, with his friend Tommaso, the painter. They seemed to be arguing with increasing excitement, till Tommaso cried, "That you never will do.
I wager you never will." The others listened. "What's the matter?" inquired Gaetano Strozzi, strolling up with some of his friends. Tommaso explained. "Palla says that at the festival he is going to kneel down before Beatrice Altichieri, that proud girl, and beg her to permit him to kiss the dusty hem of her robe." They all laughed, and Leonardo of the house of Riccardi said, "Palla will think twice about that. He well knows that the fairest ladies have a smile for him, which at other times one never sees upon their faces." Another added, "And Beatrice is still so young. Her lips are still too childishly firm to smile. That is why she seems proud." "No," retorted Palla degli Albizzi with excessive vehemence. "She is proud, but that is not the fault of her youth. She is proud as marble in the hands of Michelangelo, proud as a flower in a picture of the Madonna, proud as a ray of sunlight falling on diamonds." Gaetano Strozzi interrupted him with some severity. "And you, Palla, are you not also proud? To hear you, one would think you wanted to take your place among the beggars who wait at vespers in the courtyard of Santissima Annunziata, till Beatrice Altichieri passes, and with averted face gives each of them a soldo." "I will do even that," cried Palla with blazing eyes, and pushing his friends aside, he sprang down the staircase and disappeared. Tommaso was about to follow him, but Strozzi held him back. "Let him be. He is better left to himself. Then he will come to his senses sooner." And the young men dispersed into the gardens. That evening, as usual, some 20 beggars, men and women, waited for vespers in the forecourt of Santissima Annunziata. Beatrice, who knew them all by name and would sometimes visit the children and the sick in their wretched homes at the Porta San Nicolo, was accustomed to present each one of them in passing with a small piece of silver. Today she seemed to be late. The bells had already ceased to ring, and only thin threads of sound still hung about the towers in the darkening air. An uneasiness spread among the beggars, also because a new beggar, a stranger, had slunk into the shadow of the porch, and they were about to drive him off in their greed, when a young girl in a black, almost nun-like dress appeared in the forecourt. Hampered in her progress by her pitying kindness, she went from one to the other, while one of her waiting women held open the purse from which she took her little gifts. The beggars fell on their knees, sobbed, and sought to lay their shriveled fingers for 1 second on the simple gown of their benefactress, or kissed its outer hem with their wet, stammering lips. She had passed them all, and not one of the figures she knew so well was missing. But suddenly she became aware of another, a strange figure in rags standing under the shadow of the porch. She was startled and confused. She had known all her poor friends since her childhood, and to help them seemed as natural to her as to dip her fingers in the marble font of holy water that stands at the entrance of every church. It had never occurred to her that there might be beggars one did not know. Had one the right to help these too, when one had not earned the confidence of their poverty by somehow knowing of it? Would it not be an unheard-of presumption to offer a stranger alms? And filled with the conflict of these dark emotions, the girl passed the new beggar by, as though she had not seen him, and stepped quickly into the high, cool church. But inside, as the service proceeded, she could not remember a single prayer. A fear seized her that after vespers the poor man might have left the porch, and she had done nothing to lessen his need, when the night was so near, in which all poverty is sadder and more helpless than by day. Signing to the one among her waiting women who carried her purse, she slipped out with her into the porch. It was empty now, save for the stranger, who still stood there, leaning against a pillar, seeming to listen to the sound of singing, that came, strangely remote, as out of distant heavens, from the church. His face was almost entirely hidden, as is sometimes the custom with those lepers who do not uncover their hideous sores until one stands close before them, and they are sure that pity and horror will both speak in their favour. Beatrice hesitated. She was carrying the little purse herself, and felt that it contained no more than a few small coins. But with a sudden resolve, she went up to the beggar and said in an uncertain, slightly sing-song voice, and without lifting her fugitive gaze from her own hands, "I would not offend you, sir. I think, if I recognize you aright, I am in your debt. Your father, I believe, made the fine balustrade in our house, the balustrade of wrought iron, you know, that adorns the staircase. Later, they found, in the room where he sometimes used to work, a purse. I think he must have lost it, I am sure." But the helpless lie upon her lips forced the girl to her knees before the stranger. She pressed the brocade purse into his hands, hidden in his cloak, and stammered, "Forgive me." Beatrice felt the beggar tremble. Then she fled back into the church with her frightened waiting woman. Through the open door there burst a short, triumphant peal of voices. That is the end of the story. Messer Palla degli Albizzi stayed in his rags. He gave all he had to the poor, and went forth barefoot and destitute into the land. Later, he is said to have lived near Subiaco. "Oh, these old stories," said the schoolmaster. "What's the good of it all? He was on the way to becoming a profligate, and through this incident he turned into a vagabond, an eccentric. I'm sure nobody remembers him now." "Oh, but they do," I ventured to contradict. "His name is mentioned now and then in the great litanies of the Catholic Church, among those of the intercessors, for he became a saint." The children have heard this story too, and they declare, to the annoyance of the good schoolmaster, that God comes into it. I am rather surprised at that myself, for I had promised the good schoolmaster to tell him a story in which God was not even mentioned. But, of course, the children must know. A Story Told to the Dark by Rainer Maria Rilke. I wanted to put on my coat and to go to my friend Ewald, but I had lingered over a book, an old book at that, and evening had come, as in Russia spring comes. A moment ago the room had been distinct, even to its remotest corners, and now all the things in it were as though they had never known anything but twilight. Everywhere large dark blossoms opened, and luminous gleams slipped about their velvet chalices, as on dragonfly wings. The lame man would surely no longer be at his window, so I stayed at home. What was it I had wanted to tell him? I no longer knew, but after a while I felt that someone was entreating me for this last story. Some lonely man, perhaps, standing very far away at the window of a dusky room, or perhaps this very darkness itself that surrounded me and him and all things. So it happened that I told my story to the dark, and it leaned ever closer to me, so that I could speak more and more softly, quite as befits my story. It takes place in the present, and begins. After a long absence, Dr. Georg Lassmann was returning to the home of his birth. He had never possessed much there, and now he had only 2 sisters left in his native city, both married, apparently well married. To see them again after 12 years was the purpose of his visit, so he himself believed. But in the night, unable to sleep in the overcrowded train, it became clear to him that he was really going home for the sake of his childhood, hoping to rediscover something in these old streets, a doorway, a tower, a fountain, anything to awaken some joy or some sorrow by which he might recognize himself again. one gets so lost in life. And then he remembered many things. The little apartment in the Heinrichsgasse, with the shiny door latch and the dark-coated tiles, the well-cared-for furniture, and his parents, those two threadbare beings, standing almost awed beside it. The swift and harassed weekdays, and the Sundays that were like emptied rooms. The rare visitors whom one received, laughing and embarrassed. The piano that was always out of tune, the old canary, the heirloom armchair in which one might not sit, a birthday, an uncle who came from Hamburg, a puppet show, a barrel organ, a children's party, and someone calling, "Clara?" The doctor had almost dropped off. They were in a station. Lights went by, and the listening hammer went ringing along the wheels. And that was like, "Clara, Clara, Clara," the doctor reflected, now wide awake. Who was Clara, anyway? And immediately he became aware of a face, a child's face with fair, straight hair. Not that he could have described it, but he had a sense of something quiet, helpless, resigned, and of a pair of narrow, childish shoulders, drawn still more together by a washed-out little dress, and he began to imagine a face to go with them. But then he knew that he need not imagine it. It was there, or rather, it had been there then. So the doctor recalled his only playmate, Clara, not without effort. Until the day he went to a boarding school at the age of about 10, he had shared with her everything that happened to him, little that it was. Or was it much? Clara had no sisters or brothers, and he had as good as none, for his elder sisters did not concern themselves with him. But since then, he had never asked anyone about her. How had that been possible? He leaned back. She had been a pious child, he still remembered, and then he asked himself, what can have become of her? For a time, the thought frightened him that she might have died. A sickening dread came over him in the closely packed compartment. Everything seemed to confirm this assumption. She had been a sickly child. She hadn't been very well off at home. She had often cried. Undoubtedly, she was dead. The doctor could not stand it any longer. He disturbed certain of the sleepers, pushing his way between them into the corridor of the car. There he opened a window and gazed out into the blackness with the dancing sparks. That quieted him, and when he returned to the compartment later, he soon went to sleep, in spite of his uncomfortable position. The reunion with his two married sisters passed off not without embarrassment. The three had forgotten how far apart they had always remained, notwithstanding their close relationship, and endeavoured for a while to act like brother and sisters. But they soon silently agreed to take refuge behind that polite, non-committal tone which social intercourse has invented for all occasions. He dined at his younger sister's house. Her husband was a wealthy manufacturer with the title of Imperial Councillor, and it was after the fourth course that the doctor asked, "Tell me, Sophie, what's become of Clara?" "Which Clara?" "I don't remember her name. That little girl, you know, the daughter of one of our neighbours, with whom I played as a child." "Oh, you mean Clara Solner." "Solner, that's it, Solner. Now I remember. Old Solner was an awful old man. But what of Clara?" His sister hesitated. "She married, and now she lives altogether in retirement." "Yes," went on the Imperial Councillor, and his knife slid rasping across his plate. "Quite retired." "You know her too?" The doctor turned to his brother-in-law. "Yes, just slightly. She's pretty well known here, of course." Husband and wife exchanged a look of understanding. The doctor noticed that, for some reason, they did not care to say more on the subject, and he let it drop. But when the lady of the house had left them to their coffee, the counsellor showed all the more eagerness to pursue it. "This Clara," he asked, with a sly smile, watching the ash that fell from his cigar into a silver bowl. "Wasn't she supposed to be a quiet child, and a plain one at that?" The doctor said nothing. The counsellor moved confidentially closer. "That was a story. Did you never hear of it?" "But I haven't seen anybody to talk to." "Talk to?" The counsellor laughed cunningly. "You could have read it in the papers." "What?" asked the doctor nervously. "Why, she ran off and left him." From behind a cloud of smoke, the manufacturer discharged this astonishing sentence, and waited complacently for the effect. But the effect did not seem to please him. He took on a business-like manner, sat up straight, and began to report in another, an injured tone, as it were. "Well, they had married her to Lair, the county council's architect. You wouldn't have known him. Not an old man. My age. Rich. Thoroughly respectable, you know. Thoroughly respectable. She hadn't a penny, and besides, she had no looks, no education, nothing. Still, Lair didn't want a great lady, just a modest wife, a good housekeeper. But Clara, she was taken round into society. Everybody was kindly disposed towards her. Really, they acted. Well, you know, she could easily have made a position for herself, when one day, hardly 2 years after the wedding, off goes Clara. Can you imagine it? Gone. Where? To Italy. A little pleasure trip. Not alone, naturally. All that last year we hadn't invited them, as though we had suspected. Lair, a good friend of mine, a man of honour, a man—
"And Clara?" the doctor broke in, rising.
"Oh, yes. Well, the punishment of heaven fell upon her. You see, the man in question, an artist, they say, you know, a casual sort of bird, naturally. Well, when they got back from Italy to Munich, goodbye, and she saw him no more. Now she's sitting there with her child."
Dr. Lassman strode excitedly up and down. "In Munich?"
"Yes, in Munich," replied the counsellor, and also rose. "They say she's having a pretty bad time."
"How bad?"
"Well," the counsellor gazed at his cigar. "Pecuniarily, and then, anyhow. God, what an existence."
Suddenly he laid his well-groomed hand on his brother-in-law's shoulder and clucked with pleasure.
"You know, they also used to say that she lived on—"
The doctor turned short about and left the room. The counsellor, whose hand had fallen from the other's shoulder, needed 10 minutes to recover from his astonishment. Then he went into his wife and said angrily, "I've always said so. Your brother is a crazy fellow." And she, having just dozed off, yawned lazily.
"Oh, Lord, yes."
A fortnight later, the doctor departed. He suddenly realized that he must seek his childhood elsewhere. In the Munich directory, he found Clara Solner, the name of a suburb, the street, and number. He announced his coming and drove out. A slender woman greeted him in a room full of light and kindliness.
"Georg, and you remember me?"
The doctor stood still in amazement. At last he said, "Well, it's really you, Clara." She held her calm face with its clear brow quite still, as though to give him time to recognize her. It took a long time. Finally, the doctor seemed to have found something that proved to him that his old playfellow really stood before him. He took her hand again and pressed it, then slowly let it go and looked about the room. It seemed to contain nothing superfluous. A desk with papers and books stood by the window,
at which Clara must just have been sitting. The chair had been pushed back. "You were writing?" And the doctor felt how silly the question was. But Clara answered unconcernedly, "Yes, I'm doing some translating." "For publication?" "Yes," Clara said simply. "For a publishing firm." Georg noticed some Italian photographs on the walls, among them Giorgione's concert. "You are fond of this?" He stepped nearer to the picture. "And you?" "I have never seen the original. It's in Florence, isn't it?" "In the Pitti. You must go there." "Just for that?" "Just for that." There was a free and simple serenity about her. The doctor looked up thoughtfully. "What's the matter, Georg? Won't you sit down?" "I'm upset," he faltered. "I thought... But you aren't in the least miserable," he suddenly exclaimed. Clara smiled. "You have heard my story." "Yes, that is... Oh," she interrupted quickly, as she saw his brow darken. "It's not people's fault if they speak differently of it. The things we experience are often inexpressible, and anyone who insists on telling them, nevertheless, necessarily makes mistakes." A pause. And the doctor... "What has made you so gentle?" "Everything," she said softly and warmly. "But why do you say gentle?" Because you really ought to have grown hard. You were such a weak, helpless child. Children of that sort later either frow hard or they die, you mean? Well, I died too. I died for many years. From the time I last saw you at home until..." She took up something from the table. "See, this is his picture. It flatters him a little. His face is not so clear-cut, but nicer, simpler. I'll show you our child in a moment. He's asleep in the next room. A boy, called Angelo, like him. He is away now, travelling far away." "And you are all alone?" asked the doctor absently, still absorbed in the photograph. "Yes, I and the child. Isn't that enough? I will tell you how it is. Angelo is a painter. His name is little known. You would never have heard it. Until lately, he had been struggling with the world, with his plans, with himself and with me. Yes, with me too. Because for a year I've been begging him to travel. I felt how much he needed it. Once he asked jokingly, 'Me or a child?' 'A child,' said I. And then he went." "And when will he come back?" "When the child can say his name. That's how we arranged it." The doctor was about to say something, but Clara laughed. "And as it's a difficult name, it will take a while yet. Angelino won't be 2 till summer." "Extraordinary," said the doctor. "What, Georg?" "How well you understand life. How big you have grown. How young. What have you done with your childhood? We were both such helpless children. But that can't be altered or wiped out." "You mean we ought to have suffered from our childhood by rights?" "Yes, I mean just that. From that heavy darkness behind us with which we preserve such feeble, vague relations. There comes a time when we deposit in it all our firstlings, all beginning, all confidence, the seeds of all that which might perhaps some day come to be. And suddenly we realize that the whole thing has sunk in a deep sea, and we don't even know just when. We never noticed it. As though someone were to collect all his money and buy with it a feather to stick in his hat. Whist, the first breeze carries it away. Naturally he arrives home without his feather, and nothing remains for him but to look back and think when it could have flown off. You are thinking of that, Georg? Not now. I've given it up. I myself begin somewhere behind my 10th year, at the hour when I stopped praying. The rest doesn't belong to me. And how is it then that you remember me? That is just why I have come to you. You are the only witness to that time. I believed I could find again in you that which I cannot find in myself. Some movement, some word, some name that has significance, some enlightenment. The doctor's head sank into his cold, uneasy hands. Frau Clara pondered. I remember so little of my childhood, as though there were 1,000 lives between. But now that you remind me of it so, something comes back to me. One evening you came to us unexpectedly. Your parents had gone out to the theatre or something of the sort. Our house was all lit up. My father was expecting a guest, a relative, a distant, wealthy relative, if I remember rightly. He was coming from I don't know where, but in any case from some distance. We had already been expecting him for 2 hours. The doors were open, the lamps were burning. My mother went over from time to time and smoothed an antimacassar on the sofa. Father stood at the window. Nobody dared sit down for fear of displacing a chair. As you happened to come, you waited with us. We children listened at the door. And the later it grew, the more marvellous a guest did we expect. Yes, we even trembled, lest he might come before he should have attained that last degree of splendour to which he drew nearer with every minute of his not coming. We were not afraid that he might not appear at all. We knew for certain he would come. But we wanted to leave him time to grow great and mighty. Suddenly, the doctor raised his head and said sadly, So we both knew that he didn't come. I had not forgotten it either. No, Clara agreed. He didn't come. And after a pause, but it was lovely all the same. What? Oh, well, the waiting, the many lamps, the stillness, the festive atmosphere. Something stirred in the next room. Frau Clara excused herself for a moment, and as she returned, brightly and serenely, she said, We can go in now. He's awake and smiling. But what was it you wanted to say just now? I was just wondering what could have helped you to yourself, to this calm possession of yourself. Life certainly hasn't made it easy for you. Evidently something helped you that I haven't got. What might that be, Georg? Clara sat down beside him. It is strange. When one night 3 weeks ago I remembered you again on the train, I thought, she was a pious child. And now, since I have seen you, although you are so entirely different from what I had expected, in spite of that, and yet, I would like to say only the more surely, I believe I feel that what led you through all dangers was your piety. What do you call piety? Well, your relation to God, your love of God, your belief. Frau Clara closed her eyes. Love of God. Let me think. The doctor watched her tensely. She seemed to speak her thoughts slowly as they came to her. As a child, did I love God? I don't think so. Why, I never dared. It would have seemed to me insane presumption. That isn't the right word. Like blasphemy to think. He is. As though I had thereby compelled him to be in me, in that weak child, with the absurdly long arms, in our poor dwelling, where everything was imitation and false, from the bronze wall plaques of papier-mâché to the wine in the bottles that bore such expensive labels. And later, Clara made a defensive gesture with her hands, and her eyes closed tighter, as though she feared to see something dreadful through the lids. Why, I would have had to drive him out of me if he had been living in me then. But I knew nothing about him. I had quite forgotten him. I had forgotten everything. It was in Florence when, for the first time in my life, I saw, heard, felt, realized, and simultaneously learned to be thankful for all those things, that I first thought of him again. There were traces of him everywhere. In all the pictures I found traces of his smile. The bells were still alive with his voice, and on the statues I recognized the imprints of his hands. And you found him there? Clara looked at the doctor with large, happy eyes. I felt that he had been. Somewhere, once, had been. Why should I have felt more? That was already more than enough. The doctor got up and went to the window. He could see a stretch of field and the little old village church, and above it the sky, no longer quite untouched by evening. Suddenly Dr. Lassman asked, without turning round, "And now?" Receiving no answer, he came softly back again. "Now," Clara faltered as he stood before her, and then raised her eyes full to his face. "Now I sometimes think he will be." The doctor took her hand and kept it a moment. He seemed to gaze into the unknown. "What are you thinking of, Georg?" "I'm thinking that it's like that evening once more. You are again waiting for the wonderful guest, for God, and know that he will come, and I have joined you by chance." Clara rose, calm and happy. She looked very young. "Well, this time we'll really wait until it happens." She said it so joyfully and so simply that the doctor had to smile, and so she led him into the adjoining room to her child. In this story, there is nothing that children may not know. Still, the children haven't heard it. I have told it only to the dark, to no one else, and the children are afraid of the dark and run away from it, and if some time they have to stay in it, they shut their eyes hard and put their fingers into their ears. But for them also, the time will come when they will love the dark. The dark will tell them my story, and then they will understand it better too.